This story began with a girl who was the illegitimate child of the Balasite family. She had a very unhappy life. Her half-sister was taking out all her anger and pain on the girl. She didn't think they were on the same level. This girl was her father's puppet that he used in all sorts of ways for the sake of the family. Plus, her own fiancé had a hand in her death. The girl kept thinking that God thought her life was miserable too. And when she opened her eyes again one day, it was back to a day when she was 20 years old. It was a new and second life for the girl. This time she decided that she would destroy all those who had brought her to this point. The girl decided that she would live only for revenge. And for starters, after pretending to be madly in love, the girl married a longtime enemy of the Balasite family. His name was Marquis Winterfell. He's from the north. And if the girl is the daughter of his enemy, surely the Marquis could not sincerely fall in love with her. She thought everything had worked out just as she'd planned. But something went wrong. The great perennial war between the kingdom and the demons by the efforts of one hero ended with the victory of the kingdom. People welcomed the savior who ended this war, and his name was Li Ji-ho. There are nicer descriptions for him, such as he is a warrior from another world, a dragon slayer. He is also the fiancé of the Duchy of Balasit's jilted wife, Lady Nadia Balasit. Nadia had no choice because their marriage was arranged before Li Ji-ho became a world hero. That's how the whole tragedy of this story began. Nadia Balasit. She is the daughter of a concubine from the Balasit family, a puppet. The girl did not dream that her own father would recognize her. He did not understand why they needed this useless trash, because it only spoiled the dignity of their family. And always Nadia was compared to her younger sister, who had been spoiled since childhood. And the servants also treated her with disdain. But suddenly the girl had a chance to gain her father's respect. One day he came to the girl and said that he had some business for her. The man said that marrying him will help them a lot in their family. And this particular marriage is with Li Ji-ho. Back then, Li Ji-ho was a mercenary who had been summoned from another world for the sake of protecting the kingdom. The speed of his development was so fast that it even scared many people. Duke Balasit was sure that if he tied him to his daughter, it would surely play into his hands. And so he entered into a sham marriage with Nadia, and they both became pawns of the Duke of Balasit. Nadia was determined at that moment that she would succeed in life, and no one would dare to ignore her wishes. Even though they were forced to marry, the girl still had hope that one day they could live as a normal husband and wife. But that was all until she fell into the trap. She went to jail. Nadia tried to prove that it was all a misunderstanding and nothing was her fault. But her sister only laughed and said that apparently the girl still didn't realize the predicament she was in. She apologized and said that Lord Li Ji-ho would never come to her again. Nadia didn't know what she was talking about. The sister said that things had changed dramatically since she first married him, for he had now become the most important man in this country, and his wife could not be a girl like Nadia. All this was said by Nadia's half-sister, a girl named Karain Balazit. Karain asked her sister, so what was the misunderstanding? Apparently she had mistakenly thought she was the one who had imprisoned her in this dungeon. Nadia began to protest. She was saying that this matter could not be. The girl was very angry at this situation. She said that her sister and father must have had something to do with it. At first Nadia thought it was because of her feud with her half-sister. Karain wondered if her sister really thought so. It is, after all, a major scandal that has spread throughout high society. There was only one way to make it look like this marriage never happened. Father ordered that Nadia be given alcohol at the upcoming banquet. Normally that girl is very cautious. That's why you have to spike the drugs to make her intoxicated. After that they hired a man, and when it starts they will call people right away. The more witnesses the better. People, when they saw all this, began to say that it was just the height of indecency. At the banquet itself, it is immediately obvious that she is the daughter of a concubine. Sister moved closer to Nadia and asked, did she know that it was a great idea that Lord Li Ji-ho himself had suggested? At that moment, the girl thought so, and realized that after that incident, her husband never visited her. Nadia thought it was because he was disappointed in her, but in fact, it was he who planned the whole thing. And even marriage to such a girl, the daughter of a concubine, he must have considered it discrimination against him. Nadia told her sister that if he had simply suggested a divorce, she wouldn't have objected. But at that moment, the girl thought that she was, after all, a mere derelict, and it was rather foolish to hope for anything at all. Karain said he couldn't do that because his reputation would suffer. After all, he is a war hero. Nadia was quiet for a moment and said, That means she came because she felt sorry for him. And now he's become a hero and… But at that moment her sister interrupted her and told her that she could say what she wanted, because this was her last chance. It's all she has left. But Nadia did not know what she was talking about. Then the sister asked who would accept someone who had been abandoned by her husband because of an affair with another man. Besides, she is a bastard child and will not be able to marry anyone but a simple laborer. Karain asked, in that case, if it wouldn't be better to die with honor. At this moment, the sister launched the men who were with the rope into the dungeon and said that she would help her in this difficult matter, but only once. The men went into her cell and began to tie a rope around her neck. The sister continued to talk. She said that her father wanted to let her stay, but she decided to commit suicide because of the shame she felt. And poor hero Lord Ji-ho suddenly lost his wife, but Nadia tried to resist. She screamed that she didn't want all this. Karain wouldn't stop talking. She said it was their way of defending their honor and the honor of the entire Balasite family, and only Nadia's name will be tarnished by her shameless misbehavior for which she was punished. But the girl didn't want to die. She just wanted to go on living. Karain said she would be remembered as the one who knew shame. Nadia couldn't breathe anymore. The girl couldn't believe her life would end like this. All her worthless life she had done as her father told her, obeyed. As a child, Nadia always watched her stepmother's reaction. She couldn't even breathe without her permission. The stepsister took away all the good things from the girl and didn't even regret it. Karain, when Nadia was almost dead, came close to her and said goodbye to her, telling her that she would miss her. And eventually Nadia died, having lived only 23 years. The girl thought that this was how it would end. But when she opened her eyes, she was back to a day when she was 20 years old. The first thing the girl did while sitting on the bed was to feel that there was no rope around her neck. She could breathe in peace. Nadia didn't understand how she had survived. In her dark mind, she could definitely feel death enveloping her body, but she eventually woke up perfectly healthy in her room. Besides, things don't look the same as they did 3 years ago. Nadia just couldn't believe she was back in the past. The girl thought that even if it was true, she had another chance, a chance for her to get her revenge. A selfish fiancé, a sister who laughed while Nadia was killed, and a father who used her and then simply got rid of her. Like some unnecessary thing just picked up and thrown away. And if you were given a second chance, what would you choose? Live for love or live a long life in good health? Nadia already knew what she wanted, so she wouldn't have had any doubts if someone had asked her. Then suddenly a maid came into Nadia's room and she asked if she was awake already. If she was, she should have rung the bell immediately. The maid said she was the reason she couldn't clean her room, and at that point Nadia really decided to choose revenge. The maid immediately approached the girl and asked what she was doing. If she touched the mirror with her hands, she would leave stains on it. Nadia had been worried all along that it might just be a dream, but as time went on, she realized that she had indeed somehow gone back in time. Because this is the maid who has now begun wiping the mirror, the responsibility for the cleanliness of Nadia's room before Karain killed the girl herself 3 years ago. Oh, and besides, on the day of the banquet when she was captured, the maid had planted Nadia's alcohol on Karain's orders. The girl drank it and immediately passed out. It was too suspicious to call it a coincidence, when she didn't realize it was all a trap, and that she had been tricked by the servant. But it was different now, and there was no way Nadia would fall for it again. Suddenly the maid turned to the girl and asked her what that look on her face was. Was she trying to tell her something? But Nadia replied that it was nothing, and afterward thanked the maid for always cleaning there. The maid was shocked. She couldn't even say anything after that, and Nadia, going to the door, said she would be out for a while. As the girl walked out the door, she was met by the head maid, and addressed her mistress. The girl said that His Majesty the King had come to see the Duke, and she needed to prepare to meet His Majesty. Nadia was very surprised when she heard that the king had come to see her father, but replied that it was just in time and she would be ready soon. After a while, Nadia packed up and went out to see her father, the Duke of Balasite. The girl bowed and asked if he had summoned her, but the Duke answered rudely that she was very late. Nadia gave him a scornful look and replied that she was just getting ready in a hurry, but the Duke looked at his daughter as if she were some kind of a lowlife. In the past, she had been afraid of that look, and had meekly obeyed, trembling with fear. After a short silence, Balasite said that he would tell her everything on the way, so let her listen carefully. It's about the triumphal ceremony. Therefore, the king and Kamshi along with Karain must take care of the tea. Also the issue of Nadia awarding Lord Ji-ho with a laurel wreath will come up. She need only agree to it, Nadia replied. Well, she realized that the king had come because of the ceremony to celebrate the triumph during Kalai's expedition. Holding such ceremonies is a long tradition. At it, a girl of married age puts a laurel wreath on the hero for whose sake the ceremony is organized. In other words, it's like a declaration of love. The problem is that at this ceremony, one of the people being honored is the one being honored. He's a northerner, which means he's the South's worst enemy. Nadia thought that was probably why her father wanted to shift the focus to something else. By allowing Nadia to give the wreath to Li Ji-ho, they want to tie him to the girl through marriage. Even if she refuses, her father won't listen, but she needs to free herself from her father and Li Ji-ho. After a while, they came to the right room and entered it. Karain was already serving the king. When they entered, the Duke immediately greeted His Majesty the King. When he saw him, he said he was just waiting for him. Let him sit down soon. After they sat down, the king asked, "Probably he already knows why he came to see him?" But the Duke replied, "How could he possibly know that? He has no mind-reading ability." But the king said not to play dumb. He already knows everything. The Kalai expeditionary force demanded a triumphal ceremony. The Duke took a cup of tea and replied that they deserved it, and let the king do as they ask. But the man got angry and said that it's not the problem at all. It's who's standing in that unit. One of the leaders with the most merit is their worst enemy from the north, the Marquis of Winterfell, and he will get quite a bit of attention at this ceremony. Then the northerners will think too much of themselves. The king didn't understand how he could speak so calmly about such things. The Duke answered him not to worry about it. He wouldn't shift the focus of the ceremony to something else, and he had a plan to tie the Northman's hands. The king was surprised and told him to tell him soon. Nadia, when she heard all this, thought that he had not hesitated to take seriously what her father had said. It was already no surprise to her that the northerners were not happy. But then suddenly the Duke said they would bind them in marriage. Let the king use his authority and order him to marry. The Duke said let his bride be the daughter of a nobleman from the south. Then they could prevent him from uniting with someone from the north and becoming even stronger. Hearing those words, Nadia remembered all the details of her past that had faded from memory over time. After she and Li Ji-ho became married, as a reward for her success in the expedition, the Marquis of Winterfell also got married. And of course his bride was a girl from the family who was introduced to the king by the Earl of Balasit. It was rumored that she constantly cried because of the Duke's cruelty, and finally ran away. In fact, Nadia felt very sorry for the girl who had become only a puppet in her father's plans. But then suddenly, the girl had a thought. If she were to be that girl now, it would mean she could avoid the marriage with Li Ji-ho, as well as the revenge she craved. The girl thought she couldn't be reckless, and it was too early to tell. The king replied that it was a good idea, but who would willingly give him his daughter? The Duke thought for a moment, and replied that apparently His Majesty did not believe in the loyalty of his servants. For the sake of the country, people would certainly give up their daughter. At that moment Nadia thought that this was it. Now it was time to act. So the girl went up to the king and addressed His Majesty, asking for forgiveness. She said she had something to tell him. Nadia said that if he needed to, she could go to the enemy camp to the north. Something she could do. At this point, Karain became indignant and asked her sister how dare she interfere in the conversation. The Duke, hearing this, became very angry, but the girl went on. She said she was of the Balasit family, who had served His Highness all her life. Therefore, she is the most trustworthy of all. In fact, Nadia felt a little sorry even for her father, but she has to do it. So the girl asked the king to let her marry the enemy for the sake of His Highness and the welfare of their country. But Nadia, in her father's hands and in his dirty games, she's not going to participate either. The Duke suddenly spoke up and asked his daughter if she was really going to marry the Marquis of Winterfell. Apparently she doesn't know what she's talking about. The king said that it must be that his daughter didn't know what his relationship with Winterfell was. The king at this point sat and thought, and afterwards said it was a commendable decision. But as her father had said, weren't their families sworn enemies? Forcing someone else would be a lot easier than marrying a girl off to him. The Marquis of Winterfell might not take her as his wife. At that moment, the king said that she had a great idea, hadn't she? Nadia replied that yes, she did. She then said that she would present a laurel wreath to the Marquis of Winterfell at this ceremony. The Duke was unhappy with her decision. He said she was very stupid. Did she really think he would just accept a wreath from her? But Nadia replied that yes, because so far no one had yet refused the laurel wreath. The Duke, after calming down a bit, replied that such things are decided in advance. They had already planned for the girl to give the wreath to Li Ji-ho. Nadia was silent for a moment. Then, in a quiet voice, she said that he would never refuse her. Father asked why she was so sure of that. Nadia said she had overheard their conversation while she was making tea, and asked if it wasn't the Marquis himself who had requested this ceremony. The awarding of the wreath is the point of the whole ceremony. But if someone refuses the wreath, the situation changes to the poor girl being denied her recognition. Of course, the hero is the one people love, but the love between the two is far more interesting and exciting. People will quickly forget his merits. Nadia asked, would he dare to destroy with his own hands all that he had longed for? Everything must happen just so he would accept the wreath, and then… But suddenly the girl was interrupted by her father. He said that His Majesty could influence him to refuse, then he would have no choice. Nadia confirmed her father's words. Thereupon the girl went to His Majesty and told him to insist on the marriage, under the pretext of a plea from an official's daughter. Then he will become a magnanimous ruler who only wants to make the love of a noble lady a reality. The king hesitated and said it was a rather devious plot, but it was very convincing. But still, he is a little worried. How can he send the Duke's daughter to the enemy camp? So he turned to the Duke and said that he would first ask him what he thought about it in the end. After a little silence, the Duke smiled and said that he had no idea his daughter had such a wonderful plan. At this ceremony, his daughter would present a wreath to the Marquis of Winterfell. After the king left and they were alone, Karain told her sister that she had gone completely insane. She knew the girl was stupid, but she didn't think she was that stupid. Had she done all this knowing who the Marquis really was? When Nadia remained silent, her sister continued to ask. So she was really going to volunteer to go north, even knowing that the north was their enemy? She then turned to her father and told him to answer something already. But the Duke waved Karain away and told her to stop because it was none of her business. Then he turned to Nadia and told her to explain herself. What was she thinking when she suggested that? He had made it clear exactly what her role was. How dare she disobey his orders? Even though Nadia had gotten permission from His Majesty, if she couldn't convince her father, she would lose this battle again. Therefore the girl must make the right move. Nadia answered her father that she had no desire to marry a man whose origin was unknown, though half of Balasite blood flowed in her. The Duke then asked if she had done it just because of that, because of such unnecessary pride, and now they must give all honor to the Marquis of Winterfell. Nadia tried to reassure herself, telling herself not to be afraid. She didn't want to live as a pawn anymore, after all. Then the girl replied to her father, "What honor we are talking about? Let him experience it just for a moment." Nadia asked, "Wouldn't it be more important to prevent what could happen because of this?" That's what he was trying to take people's interest away from the ceremony. Father pondered her words. Afterward, he asked how she knew about it. Nadia was glad, because that question meant she had hit the bullseye. The reason why Father is reacting to the glory of the Northmen in such a way is because the imperial family is now, without exaggeration, a puppet of the Duchy of Balasite. In other words, this is exactly what the Duke has been seeking for so long. He has the king himself in his hands, but at the same time he has the most vulnerable position he can have. There have been many instances of provincial heads plotting a rebellion in violent times like this. That's why her father is so worried. Rebellion threatens his position. Nadia thought she should dig deeper into what he was afraid of. So she said that even if not at this ceremony, they would still secretly gather. Whoever gets all the glory, they should definitely observe them. Therefore, this ceremony is the best place for such a thing. They will give water to the animal that thirsts for water, and put a collar on it that will restrain it. If Nadia marries him, they will be able to learn more quickly about the changes in the north. And thanks to her sacrifice, the Duke can quietly strengthen his position. Nadia told her father to let her do it for their family. The Duke thought for a moment. He thought that it really did make some sense. This expedition didn't go as he had expected, and because of the success of the Northmen, they have to have this ceremony. But if Nadia goes to the north as Winterfell's consort, they will be able to find out their movements faster. So it's a good chance to put a spy in his entourage. After thinking for a bit, the Duke replied that so be it, they would do as his daughter wanted. Karain, who was standing beside her father, was shocked. She immediately shouted at her father and asked if he would really send her sister to the north. But what about Lord Li Ju-hee? He was going to give Nadia to him, but her father told her to keep quiet because he could safely find him a new bride as well. Afterward, the Duke turns to Nadia and asks her what she really wants. He knows full well that she is not doing this for him or the family, so he wants the girl to tell him what she wants for her sacrifice. Until then, Nadia has been able to deceive him, so all she has to do is to answer this question correctly. After thinking well, the girl answered that she wants freedom. One day, when he defeats his enemy, Winterfell, and that's when she asks that the Duke let her live as a rich widow. Unmarried girls are condemned by society, but widows and divorcees are not. And even if she doesn't remarry, Nadia no longer wants to carry their family's name. She doesn't want to be tied to anyone. She just wants a normal life. She asked her father if he could promise her that. After that, Nadia left his office and walking down the hallway thought they had a successful deal. From the very first day she went back in time, she immediately succeeded in avoiding marriage with Li Ji-ho. But then suddenly, passing by the window, the girl noticed some sort of squabble. One of the maids shouted that it wasn't true. She hadn't done anything, but the head maid shouted at her and told her to shut up. She then asked her how she dared to touch Madame's things at all. The maid kept crying and said that she hadn't stolen anything. Nadia now realized that Karain's puppet had been kicked out as well. It turns out that the girl was given a chance to deal with everything on her own. Nadia is still, of course, a long way from revenge, and first she needs to detail her future plans. And while the girl was plotting how to destroy the Duchy of Balasite, it was already time for the ceremony. On this day, a guard approached the Marquis and told him that all preparations for the ceremony were complete and asked that he lead the troop, because it's already time for them to depart. Flower petals were flying everywhere in honor of congratulating the squad on their victory. Watching the soldiers marching in marching formation, people cheered them. Everything was happening just like in Nadia's past life. From the clothes and jewelry she was now wearing, to the seats everyone was sitting in. Everything was exactly as it had been before. At this point, Nadia reflected that if she hadn't interfered, things would have gone on as they had in her previous life, and the ending would have been the same. Then suddenly her sister turned to her and asked her, well really, what would she do if her pendant got a crack? Karain lent it to her, as it was her father's order, and once the ceremony was over, she told the girl to put it back. Nadia was shocked about her sister saying she borrowed her own mother's jewelry, but she didn't have the energy to respond. She had always tried to please before, but now the girl didn't care about that, because she is going to escape from there at any cost. But then the Duke suddenly spoke up and told the girls to stop. The troop would be arriving soon, so let Nadia get ready. He said you should try to screw it up and hand the wreath to the Duke of Winterfell with dignity. But there was only one exception to how the ceremony from a past life differed from what was happening at the time. The main character that Nadia will present the wreath to is Marquis Glen Winterfell. When Nadia looked in his direction, she noticed Li Ji-ho standing behind him. The one who was supposed to be the hero of this ceremony was her ex-husband. Despite the fact that they had not married for love, the girl felt that there was a connection between them. Remembering all those moments that Karain had told her about in her past life, the girl's heart began to beat very fast, and she felt resentful. At that moment the king was making his speech. He was telling Glen that he would give him glory for his deeds. All the knights who were there said they were honored. Afterward, the king said that he had heard that Winterfell's merit was particularly high in this expedition, and hearing about it gave him a warm feeling. Glen, who was still bowed before the king, replied that the rumors were a bit exaggerated. The king laughed and told him to put all this modesty aside, because when he looks at him, he is reminded of the past ruler of Winterfell. He was a rather distinguished knight too. The king said his loyalty was commendable, and if his bedridden father learned of his exploits, he would definitely be happy for his son. The most sore subject for the Marquis of Winterfell related to his father, but the king brought it up anyway. His Highness said he should reward the Winterfell family for their loyalty, but Glen replied that it was enough for them that he knew about it. The man smiled and said that young people in their time were very serious. And then, by the king's decree, the official ceremony began. The king addressed the people and said that on this day they had gathered in this place to congratulate the heroes on their victory in Kalia's expedition. Immediately afterward, the greeting began. The family and Duke of Balasite was the very first to meet the Marquis of Glen. He went up to him and congratulated him on his successful operation, calling him a young gentleman, but Glen interrupted him and said that he had already inherited the title, and so he was now a marquis, and if his memory failed him, he had better leave his post and rest. The Duke was angry, but he didn't show it. He said, "How can it be? He made a mistake," and then added that, though Glen had become a marquis at such a young age, there was still much he lacked. Glen said, "So that's how it is," and asked, "What could be so difficult for a man in his prime?" The Duke ignored his question and said he thought the guy did resemble the former marquis with his fervor, but then, as if remembering, he added that he was talking about the man who had had the accident. He paused for a moment and said he was sorry. This the king said that it was time to hand over the gifts prepared for the heroes, and called Nadia over. At that moment, the girl thought that this was her moment. As the girl approached Glen, he realized why the Duke had happily agreed to perform the ceremony. He decided to change the essence of the ceremony. Glen assumed that the owner of that wreath must then be Li Ji-ho, because anyone knows that Nadia's father supports him. Glen thought that this ceremony was originally just for himself, so he should just quietly let it pass and not take it personally. The expedition had actually taken longer than he thought, and he had quite a lot of things piling up at home. Glen thought that it would be very nice if they were paid handsomely as a reward. But at that moment, he noticed that a girl had approached him. That surprised him very much. Glen didn't understand why Balasite's daughter was standing right in front of him. Maybe the girl was worried about the large number of people. Then he leaned over to her and whispered in her ear that it seems she made a mistake due to excitement, and Li Ji-ho is the guy with black hair standing behind him. Glen told her to walk slowly that way, but then everyone would turn a blind eye to her little mistake due to excitement. But Nadia wasn't going anywhere. She just stood there looking at him. The man then asked why she was not going. Nadia replied that she wasn't wrong. Glen asked what she was talking about. Afterward, the girl said that the Marquis of Winterfell had been on her mind for a long time, so she asked that he accept her laurel wreath. Nadia continued to talk. She said that she fell in love with him at first sight as soon as she saw him. She felt that he was someone who could take care of her for the rest of her life. But Glen asked Lady Balasite in a whisper. Perhaps she didn't know what it meant when an adult girl hands a wreath to a man? Nadia thought at this moment that he was much ruder than he was said to be. But she replied that she knew all about it, and she was now confessing her love to him. She then held out a wreath to him. After a short silence, the king spoke. He turned to the Marquis and said that the beautiful lady was waiting, so why didn't he answer anything? Glen turned to His Majesty and said that he didn't deserve the wreath, so he couldn't accept it. He had no idea what was going on, but they certainly didn't like it. He can't fall into that trap. Nadia had expected this reaction, that he would not accept the wreath so easily. At that moment she thought that it would be very profitable for him to marry her too. So the girl came closer to him and tugged at his sleeve. She thought there was nothing to be done. She had to act. Nadia turned to him and told him that if he was worried that she was definitely a scissors, he could just accept the wreath and not worry about her. With these actions, the girl first wanted to arouse the pity of the people. Suddenly someone in the crowd shouted, "Why doesn't the Marquis accept this wreath?" Others supported and said that he was making her shameful and waiting. Is it because of his disagreement with the Duke that he is taking his anger out on this young lady? Others shouted for the Marquis to accept Lady Balasite's sincere love. At that moment, Glen thought they wanted to ruin the ceremony with his own hands. After that, he snatched the wreath from the girl and said that this was a rather long conversation, so it would be better to continue it later. Glen turned around and started to walk away. At that moment, the girl thought that she had succeeded, and just like that, she was able to change her future, which could turn out to be very sad. After this celebration, it was already evening when the Duke and his daughters were on their way to the carriage. Her father told Nadia that she had done well today. Duke said it was worth it to see Glen's confused face. He had no choice but to accept her invitation. Nadia smiled at her father and told him that he might not thank him, and thought to herself that it was in her favor after all. But then suddenly, when the Duke was about to get into the carriage, Lord Ji-ho ran up to them and said that he urgently needed to talk to him. Balasite asked the guy what's wrong. Should his body be so tired after traveling so far? and why he won't go rest. Ji-ho said he urgently needed to talk to him. He then said that he had heard that Lady Nadia was supposed to present the wreath to him at this ceremony, and asked what had happened, why she had not done so. Nadia wondered. Had his father told him about it beforehand? The Duke thought for a moment, then answered the boy. It just so happened. The matter was urgent, so he couldn't put Ji-ho on notice. He apologized to Ji-ho afterwards. The Duke said he would soon find a better match for him, so he might not be upset. The Lord got angry and said he didn't come to him to look for a new bride. He wants to know why they didn't change their plans at the last minute. The Duke replied that there was a reason, and the street was not the place to talk about it. He then told Ji-ho to go into the carriage. Tomorrow merged and asked him if he thought it was too much before he joined the army. So did the Duke, but the man immediately interrupted him and asked him what he wanted now. The ceremony had already taken place, and there was no turning back. Ji-ho sighed indignantly, and the Duke put a hand on his shoulder and said that he recognized it as his mistake for not warning him anyway. In order for the Lord to believe, he'll make it up to him and compensate him for it. After that, he'll ask if Ji-ho knows what he's talking about. The Lord remained silent, and afterward, after thinking a moment, replied, "Which is fine, so be it." The Duke then told his daughters to get on the wagon as soon as possible, and when Nadia was about to go in, she looked at Ji-ho. The girl didn't understand why he had such an expression on his face, but then she thought that she didn't need to worry about it, because now it didn't bother her at all, because he was the one who betrayed her first, so she's not going to treat him special. Sometime later in Winterfell Mansion, Glenn was sitting in his office, and his assistant came to see him. The aide said he had heard in the marketplace all but talking about the ceremony that had taken place. The lady, who was not often seen, professed her love for the Marquis. The guy said that Glenn would have to respond to this somehow, or he'd just be taken and forcibly married to a girl. Glenn sighed and said it was too late. Then he handed him the letter and told the boy to read it. The aide took the envelope and asked, "Is this really a letter from the royal family itself?" After that he began to read. When he finished, it was powder. He told the Marquis that he wanted to all of it, but they tell him to make a marriage. Glenn said that was correct, and if he continued to refuse, they would consider it disobeying the king's order. His assistant got angry and said this is over the top. Why are they doing this to him? He didn't understand what else they wanted. Glenn, on the other hand, even agreed to the expedition. Plus, the Marquis's army and lands pay taxes steadily. But even with all these points, they still doubt him. Glenn said that it must be the Duke of Balasite who has taken to saying all sorts of nasty things about him, because he wants to expose the Marquis for sedition. The northern territory where Winterfell is located was not always part of the kingdom. It was subjugated 100 years ago. The North and South, who differed in culture as well as many other things, could not easily get along with each other. The Northern Army defended the border in the north from monsters, then provided security and fertility to the South. But Southerners, despite this, considered Northerners savage and fearsome. So the previous Marquis and Marquess of Winterfell have had an accident because of someone's plot. And of course it's the Duke of Balasite who comes under suspicion the most. And there's the Duke's daughter presenting the Marquis of Winterfell with a laurel wreath. Glenn tells the aide that there are two reasons why they want this marriage to happen after all. First, to prevent the Northmen from forming an alliance through marriage. And second, and more likely, to send a spy into the enemy camp. The aide said it's a great way to get an early heads up on what's possible. So it makes sense why they're so insistent. The aide also almost forgot to mention Lord Li Ji-ho. According to the people at the ceremony, Lady Nadia was originally supposed to give the wreath to him. They say he was terribly surprised when she didn't. Glenn asked again, asking if he was sure. The aide replied that that was right. He had heard that Lady Nadia and Lord Li Ji-ho had secretly promised to unite hearts and lives. Apparently the plan that involved Lord Ji-ho was changed in a hurry, and he himself was not told about it. At this moment, Glenn thought that he knew that the wreath was originally meant for Ji-ho and not him. Then the Marquis stood up and said that he would have to do as His Majesty wanted, or else they would have a great reason to attack the Northmen. The deputy was shocked. He said, "But she's his daughter." Glenn told him not to worry. She's just a beautiful duke's daughter. What can she do in a foreign land without a single ally? Glenn even doubts that the girl will even endure the cold attitude of the servants for at least a week, and he thought it couldn't be otherwise. She'd want to come home and he'd have nothing to do with it. So the man doesn't worry too much. And just like that, the Winterfell and Balasite families were united. The wedding took place on Winterfell soil, and the engagement in the capital. After they quickly sorted out these minor things at Belicite Mansion, a banquet was held to celebrate the arrival of the new family. There were nobles there who mocked Nadia for marrying Winterfell, knowing her family's attitude towards it, as well as her father, who was enjoying everything that was going on. But now was not the time for Nadia to pay attention to them, because she has to play the role of a noblewoman in love who only has eyes for one man. When they were at this banquet, Nadia called Glenn over to dance, and at that moment the girl sensed something, namely that the Marquis of Winterfell had become even more wary of the Belicite family. So for starters, the girl needs to show him that she is not a danger. But then suddenly, while dancing, Glenn noticed the girl's concentrated face and asked what it was she was thinking. Nadia was even kind of confused at first, and then replied that she was thinking about how handsome he was, and the girl called him Glenn. But the Marquis resented that, and he said she calls him by his first name, though he and she are not close at all, so he asked that the girl call him Marquis Winterfell. Nadia replied that it was fine, if that's what he wanted, then she would call him that. After that she smiled. After dancing some more, Glenn let go of her hand and said it was a smile that even annoyed him. Afterward, the man turned to her and said he even wondered whether she would be able to smile as brightly in the north. He couldn't wait to check it out already. After that, Glenn turned around and walked away, and Nadia was left alone. Suddenly, people were heard swimming over. Oh my God, look at that, poor thing. And why did she only fall in love with Severyanin out of shame and can't even raise her head? But in fact, Nadia with her head down only smiled. She thought they should leave quickly, because she couldn't squeeze a smile out of herself anymore. After a while, Nadia decided to get some fresh air, so she went out on the terrace. The girl thought that it was very difficult after all. Her whole body even cramps from forcing herself to smile all day long. And since people are all around her, the smile never leaves her face. But suddenly the girl's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. It called out to Lady Nadia. When she turned around, she saw Lord Ji-ho. He said that here he had found her. When the girl turned around and asked what was wrong, Nadia didn't understand. What had he come to her for? The Lord came closer to her and said that he had come because he wanted to ask her something. Nadia was surprised and asked what she had nothing more to tell him. Ji-ho, in a frustrated voice, asked, "Does the girl really hate marriage with him that much?" Nadia was very surprised and interjected that he was saying such a thing. The boy asked, "Is it better for her to endure humiliation and slanted glances, and to go to the very center of the enemy camp, than to be with him?" Nadia turned to him and said she didn't understand what he was talking about, because it had not been clearly decided from the beginning that they would get married. Ji-ho said the Duke already told him everything. Okay, we switched at the girl's request. Nadia said that she has nothing more to say to him then. The man was surprised and asked, "Is he not worthy to hear the truth?" Then he suggested, "Maybe it's because he's an outsider? Because his origins are unknown?" Nadia didn't realize that this was even happening to him, since he was the one who had originally betrayed her first. Then she said that he wasn't happy about their marriage either. Ji-ho asked when he had said that, but she said she was not stupid and understood. It bothered him that he was being discriminated against because of his background. The girl asked if that was why he wanted to marry a girl from a noble family, but she was just a throwaway. If he was offered to marry Karain, he wouldn't even doubt it for a second. When the girl finished saying all that, Ji-ho didn't answer anything. He just stood there and remained silent. But it didn't even surprise her that he wouldn't be able to answer anything. Then she realized that Karain's words were true after all. What else could she have expected? Then approaching the door, Nadia said that they were not suited for each other, so let each go his own way without disturbing the other. After that, the girl went to the gazebo. When she sat down, she realized that she was very tired, but she was glad that at least in this place she could be alone. Suddenly Nadia heard footsteps. She realized that someone was coming towards her, but she didn't know who it was. And after a while, Karaini came up to her and asked if she could talk to her favorite sis. Nadia immediately asked her, "So why did she come?" She was distressed that she could not be alone even for a moment. Karain then asked, "So why does she follow a man around and dishonor their family? Does she really think the girl will just tolerate it?" Karain said that as a true daughter of the family, it was her duty to warn someone like Nadia. The girl asked, "Was she really jealous that her father only cares for her?" Karain asked, "Maybe the girl wanted his attention." That's why she went to such a desperate step. Oh, poor thing. But no matter how hard she tries, she's just a pawn in his game. Nadia said she was basically correct. And afterwards she said that her sister must not have thought that they were not so different from each other. Karain asked what she meant then. Her sister said that she didn't succeed in marrying Lord Ji-ho, so it was her turn. Karain got angry and asked what she was talking about. It's very different from her. After all, she is the daughter of a duchess. Nadia asked her, does she really still believe her father? A daughter is just a means to an end for him. Her sister asked how she even dared to rank her with a scum like her. Is Nadia really laughing at her right now? But then suddenly the girl noticed her mom's necklace on her. Karen told the girl she'd tell her dad, but when I saw no reaction from my sister, I asked her if she was ignoring her words on purpose. But then I noticed she was looking at the jewelry. Karain started to take off the necklace and asked if this was the jewelry her mother had gotten from her father, right? He gave it to her because he thought the girl would give birth to a son. And in the end, Nadia showed up and her sister said she just didn't deserve it. Then handed her the obelier and told her that if she wanted to take it, she had to get on her knees and beg for it. She should repeat after Karain and say she was sorry for acting so recklessly towards her sister. She would never annoy her again. The sister said she'd forgive her if she begged, otherwise she'd just get rid of the necklace. Karain said that she had a lot of these trinkets and could throw one away and nothing would happen. Then she asked if it was a good suggestion, but Nadia didn't answer anything. She just stood looking at her sister. Then the girl asked, didn't she want him? Then there's nothing to be done. But then suddenly Nadia shouted and told her to wait, then asked she would really give it to him if the girl kneeled. Karain, at this moment, thought that there was nothing else left for her to do, so she replied that of course she would give it to her. Let her bend her knees quickly. At this point, the girl thought that the quiet girl was suddenly starting to show herself and annoy her. Now she would teach her a lesson, but she wouldn't get the necklace back anyway. Karina said that she was very generous if the girl asked her nicely. But at that moment her sister started running straight at her. Karain was already in the water in a second. The girl asked, had she lost her mind now? What the hell is she even doing? The sister asked, does she really think she's going to get away with this act? But Nadia only asked, what happens if she doesn't? The girl said she wouldn't have returned the necklace, no matter how much she begged. Nadia already had her mother's jewelry in her hands. In her previous life, the girl had also had a similar experience. She had obeyed Karain unconditionally, but as a result, she had never been able to get her necklace back. Nadia told her sister that she had thought about it a lot as a child. Where did her sister get so much hatred for her? She wondered if she would recognize her sister as her sister, if Nadia did as she said, but eventually realized that she hated Nadia for no good reason. So now the girl had given her sister a real reason to hate her. Karain, at that moment, wondered if this was definitely the Nadia she had known all her life. She even got goosebumps. The girl felt as if her sister was a different person. Suddenly people ran up to them. Someone pointed in their direction and said that there was a person in the water. The second person saw this and shouted for someone to bring something to cover her. The man then walked over to Karain and covered her with his coat, asking if she was okay. Suddenly the Duke came in. He turned to his daughters and asked what they were making such a fuss about in the middle of the night. Karain saw him and immediately jumped up and ran into his arms. Her father asked how she got so wet. Karain pointed at her sister and said that was how the dirty girl had pushed her into the pond, and thought to herself that she wouldn't let it go so easily, and her sister would be the end of her. The Duke immediately asked his daughter if it was true. Karain at this moment thought that she had all the proof. Therefore, there was no way she would be able to justify herself. But at that moment, it was Nadia who spoke. She turned to her sister and said that despite all her hatred, how could you lie like that? She didn't listen to her, went to the edge anyway, and she said it was dangerous. Nadia said she was only trying to get her out of there. Then the girl asked if she was afraid of people thinking badly of her, but her lies would dishonor their whole family. Karain immediately got angry and started yelling, asking her how it was she was lying. Yes, it was her sister, telling untruths. She threatened her with her mother's necklace, and eventually the girl pushed her into the lake. Suddenly the girl heard the whispers of the people who had gathered around. Oh my God, did she just threaten her? At that moment, Karain realized that she had said something unnecessary. People continued to whisper. She was decorating with a necklace, so it means a younger daughter has a bad character. By the way, Why is the heirloom of the first daughter's mother's heirloom in the second daughter's possession? Was she really more loved in Hertz than Nadia? The people continued to whisper, and Karain said in an uncertain voice that none of this was true. But then suddenly her father came up to her and told her to be quiet, putting his hand on her shoulder. Karain is very cold, so let her go back to her room and get some rest so she doesn't catch a cold. He thought that if he left it alone, there would be rumors among the servants, and very unpleasant ones at that. Karain took her father's hand and said that it wasn't fair. Let her explain everything. The Duke asked what it was she was doing. He then turned to one of the servants and ordered him to take Karain to his room as soon as possible. He then turned to those present and said that apparently there had been a little quarrel between the sisters, and he was sorry that it had happened on such a bright day. Those present also said that the noble daughter of Balasite had dishonored the family so much. She will have to be very quiet for a while. In the end, her father did not side with Karain, contrary to what Nadia expected. So she turned to the Duke and said that she didn't even know that her honor was important to him, even though she had lived with him for 20 years. But in fact the girl didn't care about absolutely everything, because she had returned her mother's necklace, and now she could leave the manor in peace. The next morning in the forest near the lands of Winterfell, several knights rode, saddling their horses. Then suddenly a guy named Fabian ran up close to Glenn and addressed him. The Marquis himself said he was too noisy, so let him go back to his seat. Fabian answered him not to be like that. He would just ask something and go back to his place. He moved even closer to him and said he wanted to ask just in case it was really a figurative question. After that, Fabian asked the master in a whisper, "Wasn't Madame's confession sincere?" Glenn was shocked when he heard it. He immediately stopped his horse and said that if Fabian was going to keep talking such nonsense, let him go his way. Fabian replied that he too knew the girl was deceiving him. But looking at her face during the ceremony, it seemed to him that she was quite sincere in her words, and he wasn't so sure she was playing to the public. Glenn, after pondering his words, told him not to trust her appearance. She is, after all, the Duke's daughter. The girl could stab him in the back at any moment. Let him just look at her betrayed. Is it really to help his family in times of need, or does she only plan to keep an eye on them? Thinking about all of this, he said that it seemed like he was right. Glenn told him that if he understood everything, then let him go back to his seat. Isn't he her guardian? Let him be careful if the girl gets in trouble. It would become a headache. He said okay, and galloped off. As he rode, he wondered if he would be there for her after what he had heard. That worried him even more. At that moment, Nadia, seeing him from the window, said that he was already here, and she just wanted to talk to him. But he was missing, so she had to wait. Fabian was very surprised to see her. The guy replied that he just had a little business to attend to and wondered. Had she not heard their conversation? Nadia said that makes sense then, and also that some say he was assigned as her guardian. So what's his name? The boy got embarrassed and said his name was Fabian Knox. Nadia, when she heard this, said that he had a very nice name, and Fabian thanked her. After that he began to squeeze the horse's reins hard. The girl, when she noticed this, said that, as she thought, he was uncomfortable with her. At this point he thought he was being too obvious after all. But Nadia replied that she understood. After all, everyone knows that the Balasite and Winterfell families are enemies. But he would soon realize that her feelings for the Marquis were real. At that moment, Fabian remembered Glenn's words to him not to believe her deceptive appearance. But he immediately dispelled those memories and told the girl that not at all. He was just very shy, that's all. Afterward he said it was her first time in the north after all. And if she wanted, he could tell her about the north while they were on the road. Nadia thanked Fabian and said that she was just so bored that she didn't mind hearing his story. And she thought to herself, it was such a relief. Apparently she had managed to break through the younger knight's barriers after all. Sometime down the road, after Fabian's story, Nadia fell a little asleep. Then suddenly a guy knocked on the window, waking her up, and told her to go outside for a bit because it was already Winterfell Mansion. Nadia knew that preparations for the wedding ceremony had been rushed, but she had not at all expected what awaited her at the mansion. When she tried on her wedding dress, the maids told her that Glenn's mother had brought it with her, and it wasn't long before the wedding, so it was decided to choose it. One of the maids said that she might have heard before, but there's an influx of monsters in the north right now, and it's the bad harvest season, so people aren't in a good position. Because of this, a modest wedding ceremony is being planned. Of course, a wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event, but at that moment, Nadia interrupted the maid and said that everything was fine, and she understood everything. The maid was very surprised to hear this, but the girl said that as long as she was there for Glenn, it didn't matter what size the wedding was. Nadia said that besides, she is now the Marquis, so she should also think of her people. But then suddenly another girl came into the room and said that if Nadia felt that way, then she could be perfectly at ease, and the girl hoped that Nadia would always think so. Nadia, when she turned around, saw Mrs. Grace ground in front of her. She is Glenn's aunt. The previous Marquesa has already died, and the previous Marquis is bedridden, so now Grace is the eldest mistress in the family. Grace said that this dress fit her perfectly, and when Glenn sees it, he'll go crazy over how beautiful it is. Nadia smiled and thanked Mistress, saying that she would be very happy about it. Grace moved closer to the girl and told her that because of her father, Glenn is even rude to her, but she told the girl not to worry. She's so beautiful. So in time, Glenn will open her heart. Grace told her not to worry about anything because she will help Nadia. Let the girl focus only on opening his soul. Nadia, of course, knows what Mistress wanted to tell her with those words. She knows that Glenn still didn't acknowledge Nadia. Then she replied that it was good, and she would remember everything. After that, she smiled. Grace then said she had to go, but then before she went out, she remembered and asked the girl if she knew what the most important thing in seduction was, so she should prepare herself well. Nadia was shocked because she thought of her first wedding night. In fact, the girl thought Glenn wouldn't want to touch her, so she refused to spend the night together. Nadia wondered, what if this man offered to stay together for the whole night? And after that conversation, Nadia started thinking about it all the time, about the fact that they would have to sleep together, and even when there was a bride's exit, she thought about it. The thought never left her mind, even when the priest asked the bride and groom to say their vows. She thought they would sleep in the same room immediately after the wedding ceremony. When the priest asked the groom Glenn if he would take Nadia Balasite as his wife and swear to love her forever, the man said he would. Nadia, on the other hand, was at this moment wondering if Marquis would want to stay in the same bed with her. And when the priest asked the bride Nadia if she would take Glenn Winterfell as her husband, the girl thought about how much he hated her. Nadia doesn't know what she'll do if he really wants to do this. She certainly didn't expect that to happen. Suddenly the priest coughed and asked the bride if she would take him. Nadia, distracted from her thoughts, replied that yes, of course. Then the priest said that they should seal their vow with a kiss. When Nadia heard this, she was very surprised. She had been thinking only of how they would share the room, and the kiss had slipped her mind. Nadia thought it was okay. He'd probably pretend they were kissing. What kind of cohabitation could they be talking about? But at that moment Glenn touched his warm lips to hers, sealing his vow with a kiss. Nadia was surprised. When it was over, she was in a stupor. But at that moment, the priest said she was pronouncing them husband and wife. All Nadia could think about was that Glenn had really kissed her. And when night came, the girl was out of her mind with excitement. In her room, she did not know what to do or how to be. Nadia got even more anxious when she looked at her watch, because she realized she was running out of time, and he would be here soon. She didn't know if they were really going to sleep together. He had really kissed her at the ceremony. But at that moment, without even knocking on her room, Glenn walked in. Nadia was shocked. He had really come. Then she said she had been waiting for him, but she didn't know what to do, how to be. She couldn't run away anymore. But her musings were interrupted by Glenn's voice. He told her not to forget, because there was no way he was contacting the Duke of Balasit's daughter. Glenn leaned over and said that he was only here to tell her in person. That was the end of it. Turning around, he started to leave, but then Nadia yelled for him to wait. But the door immediately slammed shut after that. As he left, the maids heard Nadia crying. She was crying and screaming that her feelings were genuine. So why is he so cruel? In fact, the girl sat under the door and only pretended to cry. It was such a relief for her when he left. After that, she got up and walked towards the bed, thinking, here's wishing he'd never change his mind about this. As she passed the table, she looked at the champagne that was on ice, and thought that she hadn't even had a proper meal today, had she? So she ate whatever the maids had prepared for both of them. After that, she went to bed. The girl felt very well. Trying to sleep, Nadia thought she had nothing more to worry about. The bed was so soft, so she thought she was about to fall asleep, and she did. The next morning, the maids in their study were talking. One of them asked her friend if she had heard about what had happened yesterday. The master immediately left her room without even staying there for 5 minutes. He was very angry. The other maid said that she had bet that he would not go to her at all. Then the other asked, "What happened after that?" The girl with the pink hair suggested that, something most likely, they had a fight. So he got angry. She must be very embarrassed right now. The maid who stood under Nadia's door yesterday said it wasn't like that. She heard the girl crying for a long time. Her friend didn't believe her. She said it couldn't be like that. But she replied that according to Aiden, she was the mistress's maid. She looked like an unrequited girl in love who had been rejected. The girl with pink hair said that she thought Nadia would act arrogant, but still the master couldn't do otherwise. By then, they had already left their laundry room and were heading down the hall. Their conversation was overheard by the knights. Then one of them turned to Glenn and said that the maids must be taught to keep their mouths shut. Fabian agreed with his partner and said that it should be done by any means necessary. But Glenn says they don't have to do that. Let them just turn a blind eye to it and whether they really think the maids will love her anymore. After that they went and Glenn asked what the girl was doing now. Knight said what her options were. She has officially become a marquess, so she has to look after the household. Glenn, hearing this, turned to him and said, "Is he really saying that she has fully started spying on them?" When he turned to Fabian and said he was her guardian, the boy was surprised and asked, "You mean he means for him to keep an eye on Nadia?" Glenn replied that was exactly what he meant. Let him watch to see if she does anything suspicious, if she sends letters to her parents' homes. Have Fabian stay by her side and report everything to Glenn. Fabian then went to the girl and explained the situation to her. Nadia, when he had finished his story, asked, "So Glenn sent him to guard her?" Fabian smiled and said that was correct. He would take care of mistress from this day forward. At that moment, Nadia thought, did he get angry because she was watching him? Then she said she was very glad that Glenn cared for her so much. He thought she would be uncomfortable with a stranger, so he sent Fabian. The boy got a little embarrassed and said that was it. He thought that he had come to watch her, not to guard her. The girl was so happy that he felt ashamed. Fabian then said he would wait at the door. She could go about her business in peace. Nadia said okay. She didn't mind. And at that moment, she thought that apparently Glenn had decided to watch her all day long, using Fabian in the process. So she'd have to convince him somehow that she wasn't a spy. Afterward, Nadia asked Gordon, the butler, to bring her the housekeeping book. A few minutes later, the butler brought her a book. The girl sat down at the table and began to study it. Afterward, she turned to Gordon and asked why they had so much debt. She knew in her past life that the environment at Winterfell wasn't the best, but she had no idea that the sum would be so large. Gordon told her that it was the nature of the North. Every few years they are attacked by a wave of monsters. Their land is very depleted, so there are no resources, and no landmarks either. Then Nadia asked, "Don't they get rewards from the king for slaying monsters every year? What do all these funds go to?" Gordon said that thanks to this money they were able to reach today. Nadia said that in addition, the Marquis had recently taken part in the Kalia expedition, so they were no longer allowed to participate in expeditions, and the girl didn't even know that war required so much expense. Gordon replied that they did not want to take part in it. In an angry voice he said, "What? Who demanded that they do their duty?" But then, realizing what he was talking about, immediately fell silent. Nadia told him that by that someone, he was referring to her father after all. The butler immediately began to apologize and said his words were just nonsense, but Nadia wasn't listening to him anymore. She thought she would make a plan to earn the money anyway, but she didn't think the amount she owed would be that much. She wondered how the Marquis of Winterfell had paid off his debts in his past life. But then suddenly her musings were interrupted by Gordon, who said he had a good solution. When Nadia asked why, he said that she was now part of the Winterfell family too. "Well then, did he ask us to?" Will she call to say bluntly without waiting for an answer, continued, "Such difficult times for her new family. He asked if she uses the dowry to pay off her debts. Won't she help with that?" And Nadia thought, why did he give her the seal and the key to the warehouse so easily? So he wants to test her by asking her to solve her financial problems. However, the girl replied that it could not be done. Gordon said to let the lady think about it again, but the girl replied that she wasn't saying that because she didn't want to help out in the family. Let him think it over for himself. Looking at the expenditure book, one can see that every year the debt is slowly increasing. Earlier he said that the reason is a peculiarity of the North, so her dowry will not solve this issue in the long run. Yes, and it will help this year, and next year it won't, and in the end the debt will still grow.
She also said that he had previously said that the reason was the property of the North. So her dowry would not have solved this issue in the long term and would have helped only that year, but certainly not the next. In the end, the debt would still remain and grow even more. As soon as Gordon heard this, he was of course very surprised. He did not know what to answer to this. He was silent for a while. Then, in a voice trembling with fear, he said that he had not even thought about it and asked if they had not had a hopeless situation for their lands. But Nadia, smiling, hit her hand on the table and said that this is precisely why they could correct the peculiarity of their territory. The man did not understand what she was talking about, so he immediately asked how exactly she was going to fix it. After some time, the girl told everything in detail, and the man who stood behind the door listened attentively to everything. And after that, he went to report to his master. Rutger, as soon as he heard all this, was very surprised and asked if she really said that she could not use a single coin from her dowry. However, his assistant said that this was not so. She did not say that at all. The man did not understand what he meant, so he asked him to explain everything properly. And the assistant said that rather than paying off the debt right then and there, it would be better to start increasing her loyalties. And that is exactly what she told her assistant. The girl was really very happy as soon as she came up with this brilliant idea because she considered it very advantageous in their situation. The other guys who were just returning from training said that he was very naive and asked if he really believed her. One of them even said that she only seemed nice, but in reality she could be a very approachable girl. The guy hearing this was very surprised. He immediately became worried and asked, "Did they really think so?" Then one of the knights shouted and said that no matter what, she said that she still would not give up her devotion, and this was the most important result. However, the man did not want to agree with him because she looked very serious when she spoke about the financial situation of the lands, so he believed that she was probably a professional in this matter and knew what she was talking about. Then one of the knights immediately asked if the master could really trust this idiot, who couldn't even think normally, to spy on her. Another guy grabbed him in a chokehold and said that he really felt sorry for him because he turned out to be the weakest among them all. At that moment, Rutgard sighed heavily and asked them to stop doing this nonsense and return to their places, because they were making too much noise. Meanwhile, the girl, walking around the estate, noticed a great many things that she still needed to solve. In fact, there was a lot of different dirt around. Some of the figurines were broken and needed to be restored. She understood that she needed to earn money as quickly as possible in order to solve them and simply forget about everything. But at that moment, she suddenly approached the door and heard some screams downstairs. Of course, the girl was immediately very surprised, so she decided to go out and check what was happening there. Looking out from the second floor, she saw Gordon and another man who was yelling at him and saying that he heard that they had a lot of money. Of course, Nadia was very wary. She did not understand what was happening there, but decided that she needed to intervene before her poor assistant was completely torn to pieces there. The man, as soon as he saw her, immediately wanted to explain to the lady what was happening, but this complete stranger turned to her first. He looked at the girl and asked if she really was the daughter of the Duke of Balasit. Nadia replied in a completely calm voice that she would ask them to call her Marquise in Winterfell, since that was exactly what she was now. The man, smiling happily, immediately asked her for forgiveness and said that he should have introduced himself a little earlier, but still gave his name. His name was Shylock. After that, a man with blonde hair introduced himself. He was a Wayne from the Northern Traders Alliance, and there was also a girl, Katarina, from the Krita Trading Company. Nadia immediately asked them to leave these formalities aside. She immediately asked what they were arguing about so loudly that she heard it all the way from the second floor. Shylock replied that he thought that since she had already come down, then in that case they might as well tell her what was going on. The girl immediately asked him not to drag it out for too long, but to get down to business. And then the man shouted loudly and began to ask the lady to give them money. He explained that the day of repayment of the funds owed to them by the Marquis was coming very soon, so that was precisely what they had come for. As soon as the girl heard this, she was sincerely amazed and immediately asked what he meant because she did not expect such a statement. But the people who came to extort money explained that they had heard that she had brought with her her impressive devotion And if she had told them that this time she would not be able to pay off the debts, they would not have waited any longer. They said they intended to take the wind-shaded plane that had been left as collateral if she did not give them the required amount. Nadia, as soon as she heard this, immediately became worried, because this was the only fertile land, and on this depleted territory only she could grow at least some plants, so she could not give it up under any circumstances. At that moment, the girl still remembered how the Marquis paid off his debts in his past life. He simply took and gave them this land, so the girl was in real despair. Because she was too nervous, she felt very dizzy and almost fell, but Gordon was nearby and managed to catch her in time. He sat her down on the floor and asked if everything was okay with her. The girl sighed heavily and asked when the day for repaying the debts was supposed to come. With a very sad voice, the man replied that it should have already arrived very soon, somewhere in 3 months. As soon as Nadia heard this, she understood that the situation was serious, because if the plane were taken away from the family, Winterfell would become completely impoverished. No matter how powerful the army the Marquis had, if he did not have the finances, then he was completely unable to become the leader who united the North. Therefore, she understood that she had to get out of this situation by bowing to those guests who came and asking them to give her 2 months. She explained that if they could postpone this date, then she would really be able to find a demand on how to resolve this issue, and she sincerely hoped for their understanding. Of course, as soon as the man heard this, he was very surprised. Sighing heavily, he said that he understood absolutely nothing. In a confused voice, he said that they knew perfectly well that she had brought with her an impressive dowry, so he did not know why she needed to wait so much more time. Nadia explained that she was going to use her dowry for business, and that was why she couldn't just take it and cover the debt. Shylock was genuinely surprised to hear this and immediately asked what that even meant. Was she really going to open a business instead of the Dolgovs and was simply making them wait extra time? The girl explained that the Winterfell family was closely connected with merchants from the northern regions. And so she replied that it would be very nice if they would think about their long-standing friendship with them and help in creating a better future for Winterfell. The girl looked them straight in the eyes and said that if they had done this, she would never have forgotten their help and would definitely even repay them in the future. Of course, if her business had failed, they would have had to take back the land that had been left as collateral, since that would have been entirely fair. The traders, having heard this, immediately analyzed it and, having talked among themselves, they came to the conclusion that, indeed, in such a situation, they would not have lost anything. One of them asked if such a prospect of perhaps a favorable position in the future would not be worth these unfortunate few months. Shylock, without even listening to his colleagues, clapped his hands joyfully and said that this was exactly what they expected from the beautiful Marquise. He laughed joyfully and said that he was truly sincerely amazed by her wisdom because he saw it in person and it surprised him. He explained that he was ready to give an answer right then and there. However, he also needed to discuss some details with other traders, so he asked if the girl would mind waiting a little longer. Nadia, also smiling happily, replied that of course it was not a problem. She was ready to wait as long as it took. Then the man bowed, thanked her, and said that he was definitely going to give her an answer that she would like. He himself didn't understand in his head what this girl was thinking about and what stupid things she had said to him. He believed that the business of a girl who had lived her whole life without knowing any troubles certainly could not end in success, and that is why he was very happy as soon as he heard this proposal. He decided that while the rest of the idiots had to wait, he could take possession of the best land on the continent with such a mutually beneficial offer, so he left the estate very happy. As soon as the door closed, Nadia breathed a sigh of relief and told her assistant that she was very glad that they had finally left, because she had been very nervous. Gordon at that time was alarmed and asked, "What business was the lady talking about anyway? You see, if they lost the plane, everything would end in the worst way imaginable." But the girl said that he shouldn't worry at all, because they would return the money to them as they had planned, and in the meantime she began to climb back up. The man then asked why she needed the extra time, and Nadia replied that she wanted to talk to him about this in order to explain everything in detail. She asked him to invite to the mansion all those who might be willing to set aside a day to pay off the debt. She needed to buy something from them. Gordon immediately asked what this meant, and the girl replied that since she said that she would open a business, this really had to happen. However, in a rather mysterious voice, she also said that not everyone could do really important business, and they had to show what someone who trusted them and was willing to wait would get. Some time passed since then, and a number of traders gathered in the hall, and when she voiced her business idea, some of them were a little surprised. The man asked in an anxious voice if the business she was talking about was really making herbal tea from thorny vines. Nadia, smiling happily, said that this was indeed so. She was also absolutely confident in the success of such a business, so they did not need to doubt. In fact, the traders were very alarmed about this idea. They did not understand what kind of nonsense she was talking about and how she could even come up with such a thing. They had never even heard of any thorny vine, so they couldn't imagine how they could create tea from it and make a good business out of it. But in fact, the thorny vine was a herb that only the poor took. It had no value. It was a common weed that grew everywhere. But Nadia was truly confident in her success, so she asked if they could buy it for her in bulk. Wayne was very doubtful. He said that the price of this herb was quite low, but if she wanted to buy in market volumes, then of course some capital would be required. And he asked in an anxious voice whether she would be able to find this initial capital in order to buy the product stock. The girl replied that of course, because she planned to use her dowry for this. The man was shocked. He even choked on his tea. He couldn't believe that she was going to buy these weeds with that money. Wayne even thought that it would be better if she bought dresses and jewelry. At least they could be resold, perhaps even at a higher price. Then he looked at Gordon, not understanding why her faithful butler had not dissuaded the girl from this terrible idea, which would have definitely failed miserably. When he looked at his gaze, he realized that her assistant seemed to have already given up. Wayne thought about how, when she spoke so confidently last time, he thought she had a good plan, but he never thought she could come up with such a reckless idea. The man was really very upset and could not even imagine that she could be so unreasonable. At that moment, Katrina turned to the lady and said that in her opinion, such a business was not the best option, especially considering their financial situation. However, Nadia was genuinely surprised and asked why she thought so, but the girl replied that the thorny vine had no value at all. She explained that there were many good herbs that we could replace it with, and especially considering the costs of transportation and storage, they would only suffer great losses if they actually began to implement her idea. But Nadia insisted on her own and said in a rough voice that they were very much mistaken. The girl explained to the traders that she had invited them not for a discussion, but to hire them. She was ready to pay them more than usual. In this way, the girl explained that they certainly would not have suffered any losses, but on the contrary, would have even been in an advantageous position. The traders looked at each other and were silent for a while, but the one who handed over the goods finally said that since she had said so, they had no other choice. He decided to first contact all the trading firms on the continent in order to implement her idea. Katerina agreed with him and said that she thought that there would certainly be no problem in obtaining the required volume of goods. Nadia was quite pleased with this result and smiling said that she had hope only for them. She asked them to take care of everything without exception so that she would not regret her choice of assistants. And so, 2 whole months passed from that moment. Marquis Ruthorn was sitting in his office and invited Glenn to visit him for a conversation. It was his aunt who turned to the man and said that she had heard that his wife had not yet taken care of anything except her useless herb, which in her opinion had no meaning. She looked at him incredulously and asked if he was really going to just continue watching her do completely useless things. The man, who was sorting through some papers at that moment and without even looking at his aunt, explained that she had started this business with money from her dowry, so he had no right to interfere in any way. The main thing she answered was that she had no financial literacy since she believed that the second one could bring her at least some money. For this reason, the woman was very doubtful whether she could be trusted with the household at all. She believed that the girl could only make things worse. The aunt also said that the day of repayment of the debts was about to arrive very soon, at which point the man put the pen aside and addressed his aunt in a very rude voice, since she had already crossed the line. The woman did not expect that he could yell at her like that, so she stood up from her seat and replied that she had not watched her tongue and had indeed said too much. However, she asked him to remember one thing. She said this because she was thinking about the future of the family, and not just because she might not like the girl for personal reasons. After this, the woman simply turned around and walked away, leaving the man completely alone with these thoughts. Rucker already understood perfectly well that the day of repayment of debts would really come very soon, and that was precisely why he himself was no less worried. He understood perfectly well how many risks this all carried for his family, and at that moment he suddenly heard someone running very quickly down the corridor. Before he had time to come to his senses, suddenly the doors to the office opened and the butler came in. He turned to the gentleman and asked if he had heard the latest news. The guy, getting up from his seat, immediately asked what news they were talking about, and Gordon answered, out of breath, that he meant he hadn't heard yet. After all, if he had known, he wouldn't have just been sitting in the office. And the man, smiling happily, said that in fact they were saved and that was the most important news. He explained that they would not have to give up the plane, all thanks to the lady, who was able to calmly solve this problem. As soon as the guy heard this, he was genuinely surprised. After all, he had already counted on the fact that he himself would have to solve it in some way. He immediately asked the butler if this was true, and he was in genuine shock. In fact, after the girl launched the herbal tea for sale, it really helped a lot of people. One day, a girl who lived in the South was literally dying from the plague, because at that time, it was most widespread around. She was already taking her last breaths. She was in incredible pain, and her mother, who was holding her hand, noticed that she was gradually even beginning to refuse. People around were talking about this incident and realized that even she had fallen ill with the plague, although she had held out longer than anyone else. In fact, there hasn't been a single day in the last few months that they haven't been burning the bodies of people who died from this plague. Of course, they were very sad about this, and not only their village suffered, but also all the lands in the kingdom, starting with the southern territories. They really hoped that they would soon find a cure because they themselves did not want to be in their place. But at that moment, a guy who liked to read newspapers ran up to them from behind and turned to these men who were discussing the latest news and asked if they hadn't heard what they had said recently. The guys immediately became interested and asked what news he was talking about. The man, who was at that time bringing his breathing back to normal, immediately screamed loudly. He said that finally people found a cure for the plague, and as soon as the guy said this, the man could not contain his surprise. He explained that it was special and that tea made from the herbs of the thorny vine was said by many to be able to cure even the most severe phase of the plague. Of course, as soon as the merchants heard this news, they immediately decided to stock up on the thorny vine grass. However, someone had already bought it all up by the time they found out about it. And of course, this person was Nadia. She was able to calculate all the moves in advance and now earned quite a large amount of money since the grass was only hers, and she bought it at very favorable prices. One day, the girl was walking near the points where they sold her products. She saw a huge line because people wanted to buy this tea. After all, they also heard that it helped as a preventative measure. One of the girls who bought the thorn vine herbs said that she was very worried that her daughter would die, and she was very grateful that they sold it so cheaply. Of course, people were very surprised by this tactic because they knew that usually in such cases the price was greatly inflated, so the poor could not afford it. So they would have to simply accept their fate as it was. However, the man who helped sell it, smiling, said that it was all thanks to the generosity of the Marquis and that she made sure that everyone could be cured of this disease. In fact, an order was issued to begin supplying herbal tea at an affordable price, and it was necessary to start from the area where the situation was very serious. Raising the price or reselling, as well as storing the grass, were strictly prohibited. All this was done in order to reduce losses among the poor strata of the population and was very carefully monitored. The girl was incredibly happy that she did this and that she was able to come up with such an idea in time, as well as remember how exactly the events developed in the original story. And when she was riding in the same carriage with Wayne, he said that he was worried that the Southern Territory would think that they had deliberately monopolized all the medicine in the North so that the epidemic would flourish there. And indeed, from the outside, everything might have seemed that way, but Nadia was not worried about it. She said that the likelihood of this was very small. First of all, it wasn't Winterfell's who bought the whole Lhasa, but he, and besides, she asked in a surprised voice, had he really forgotten who she was anyway? Smiling happily, the girl explained that she was, after all, the daughter of a duke who came from the south, so she believed that such problems certainly could not arise for her. The thornvine grass was a breed much faster than she could have expected. Thanks to this, the traders who agreed to wait and help the girl in business all received a very large benefit from these sales, and the girl was finally able to pay off all the debts that remained on her fragile shoulders. She not only made a successful business and cured the plague, but also saved the beautiful and fertile land. And when the man who wanted to profit from her saw that she had repaid him the entire debt, he was incredibly surprised because he had so much hope for these lands, and believed that she would never succeed. And what's more, she also offered cooperation only to those who agreed to wait this time. The man was not very happy with this. However, he decided to find his way out of this situation. However, when Sheik was about to leave, the girl suddenly stopped him and said that she would like to talk to him about something. The man was of course very surprised to hear this. However, Nadia replied that his conversation with the other traders had not gone well, and she had been waiting for a letter from him in which she could receive an answer. But when the man heard this, he immediately panicked a little because he understood that the girl was testing them in this way. The girl, smiling happily, said that if he had everything, then she would ask only those who helped with the business to stay. She asked all the other people to leave as soon as possible and leave her estate. She also said that she was looking forward to the day when she and Mr. Sheik would meet again. However, this was definitely not that day. But the man, smiling maliciously, said that he, of course, was also going to wait. And until then, he wished that everything would be fine for her and that her business would only prosper. Well, of course, he was not as pleased with her success as it might seem. He was very angry because he made the wrong choice and believed in her failure. Some time passed by that moment, and when the girl finally finished talking to her traders, they started to leave. Her husband stood and watched. Meanwhile, Nadia went up to him and asked if he finally believed her now. Smiling happily, she said that after the increase in this amount, she was able to settle all the debts and she really hoped that now he could trust her. Well, the man, looking at her with a stern gaze, said that she could not see the future, but somehow she found out about what was supposed to happen. The girl explained that when she was in the South, she accidentally saw a report from the head of the Aril lands in her father's office. She then assumed that the plague would most likely spread throughout the kingdom, so it was just a simple, deductive method. However, Rutger did not believe her completely. He asked what was about the medicine. How could she guess that it would help? Then the girl explained that the maid who looked after her as a child had previously introduced her to a nomadic life, and every night she told her about her travels. And once she said that the herb of the thorny vine could help with a fatal disease. When the heat engulfed the whole body of the girl, since she was still very small, she remembered her words very clearly, and they accompanied her all her life. Of course, this was all untrue since she had read this novel and knew perfectly well what was going on. But she couldn't say so, so she came up with a new story. The man didn't respond to this for a while. He just looked at her, trying to understand if she was telling the truth. And after a short silence, Rutger bowed and asked for forgiveness for misunderstanding her, and said that he was truly sorry that he made her feel uncomfortable at some points. She, smiling happily, thanked her for telling her about this. It was really valuable to her. Then the man said that when she said that she paid off her debts and after she earned money, he thought that she was lying because he did not believe in her abilities. And the girl asked if it was true that this was also because her father was the Duke of Balasite, no matter how unpleasant it was for the man to admit it. However, this was partly true. He said that this was indeed the case and also replied that he did not understand why she decided to help him. If her father found out about this, he certainly would not like it. As soon as Nadia heard this, she made a very surprised expression on her face and asked how he had even listened to her all this time. After all, she had already told him several times about this situation. She joyfully screamed and said that she loved him very much and asked if he really didn't remember that she had told him these words. Nadia explained that precisely because she loved him, she wanted to do everything so that he would not suffer and worry as little as possible. Hearing this, the man sighed heavily and could not believe that she was again talking about this love of some kind. He did not like to talk about it, so he decided to change the subject. He replied that in any case, whatever the reason, however, she was able to pay off the long Winterfell, which meant that if she had any request for him, he would be able to fulfill it without any problems. As soon as the girl heard this, she was sincerely surprised because she didn't think that he himself could offer her such a thing. Of course, she would really like to tell him everything that was on her mind. However, she understood that in this way she would simply frighten him and therefore decided to act gradually. Smiling, she said that in that case she would like him to hug her once, for this would be the most wonderful reward for her. Rutger was very surprised to hear this. He couldn't believe that she actually asked him to do this, so he just looked at her with his eyes wide open. The girl, seeing his expression, became a little embarrassed and asked if this was really too difficult a request for him, in which case she could come up with something else. The man immediately came to his senses and said that it was not that simple. He thought that she would have had some other desire, not this one. For example, he thought that she would ask him to punish the gossiping maids or ask him to return all the money she spent over time. But Nadia, smiling, replied that if she had used such techniques, she would never have become a person of the Winterfell family. And besides, she didn't need all this. Coming closer to him, she hugged the man and asked if it would be better for him to simply fulfill her request and forget about it since it was so unpleasant for him. When she looked at him with her beautiful green eyes, he still doubted for a while what he should do. But soon he put his hands on her waist and hugged her, thinking quite hard that this was really something he could easily do for her. As soon as he moved closer to her, he felt some very pleasant aroma emanating from her. He immediately thought that it could be soap or even perfume, but he didn't care. They stood like that for a while, and he just enjoyed how sweet she smelled. However, their embrace was suddenly interrupted by a knock on the door, and the butler's voice was heard from there, telling the lady that she had to go to a business meeting. Nadia was very happy at that moment when the butler knocked because she was already thinking about how it would be best to end this hug because it was too awkward for her. However, as she was getting out of the man's arms, she looked him straight in the eyes and said that she was very sorry. However, she had to go already. Rucker pulled away from her, and his face immediately became very serious again. He said that there was no problem with that, and she could certainly go now. Before leaving, she said that she was very grateful to him for fulfilling her wish, and smiled happily at him goodbye. The girl herself wondered whether he would be able to trust her now, and she had so hoped for this. After that, the girl went to the meeting, and as soon as she entered, she immediately asked how things were going in her business. As soon as they saw the lady, the man with the blonde hair replied that thanks to the double-entry bookkeeping that she taught them, everything went very smoothly and easily, so they really liked their work. As soon as the traders heard this, you were immediately very surprised. Vine took the papers in his hands and said that this was the first time he had ever heard of such accounting. However, when he looked at them closely, he said that they had divided expenses and income into two parts, and it was now much easier to track the movement of money. He looked at the lady and immediately asked if she had really come up with such a wonderful way on her own, which now made business much easier. Nadia, laughing, immediately said that of course not. She was not that smart. She simply learned from one person who came from far away. Of course, Wayne was very surprised. He said that he didn't know where this man was from. However, he was simply incredible. For some time, he discussed this whole story with another merchant and was truly delighted. The girl was glad that, smiling, she said that she agreed, because he knew a lot of things. In fact, this person was Lord Jiho, and when she met him, she immediately began asking him what exactly his country was. The man explained that in the world he lived in, women and men could receive the same education, and this was the most common thing. As soon as Nadia heard this, she was very surprised and asked, was he really not joking? Was it really true that women were equal to men and could receive an education, just like them? The man said that it really was like that. And besides, they used the knowledge to open their own business, looked for a business that we really wanted to do, and realized our dreams and desires. Nadia was amazed then. At that moment, she really understood that she also wanted to live like these girls because she had so many goals and desires. At that moment, the man took her hand and looking straight into her eyes said that she was really very smart, and he was sorry that they had lived their whole lives in the shadow of their father. He really wanted her to have a chance to reveal all her potential and talents, because everyone deserved it. Every time they met, this guy told her something new, and thanks to him, she was able to learn to think a little wider. It helped her when she went back in time and started making her own plans. But despite this, he abandoned her in order to climb to a place a little higher. The merchant suddenly interrupted the girl from studying the papers and her immersion in her own thoughts, and said that she had better be a little more careful with the shellac. The man explained that he was very cunning and quite greedy, so he would never have been able to give up so easily. But Nadia, smiling, waved her hand and said that they shouldn't worry about it, because she asked, didn't they know who her father hated the most? The people said they didn't know this information, and then the girl replied that he didn't like those who didn't pay their taxes on time. At that moment, the man, actually sitting in his office, immediately told his assistants to begin a tax audit of traders in the north. He wanted them to find everything that could be found against them and to make sure to use it. In fact, when he allowed her to use the dowry for her stupid business, he certainly could not imagine that she would be able to succeed so much in her, in his opinion, stupid business. He understood perfectly well that there was something fishy there, and could not believe that it could really be a simple coincidence and luck on her part. He even thought about the fact that Nadia could betray him, but he quickly put those thoughts away from himself because she certainly couldn't find out about something that was unknown to him and come up with such a plan. He decided that his daughter was just lucky that time, and it played into Winterfell's hands, so he decided not to worry too much. In any case, the man knew better than anyone else that nothing lasted forever, and that time would inevitably pass, and their budget would again be at rock bottom. Thanks to the girl's wonderful and successful business, she was finally able to bring the estate into a very prosperous state, which is what she wanted to see. Her assistants around her were very surprised when everything was finally restored, because the estate now sparkled with completely different colors, and Nadia, smiling happily, said that they had no more places that needed to be restored, and they even had money left over. Gordon was so proud of the girl and delighted that he even shed a few tears. He said that it was all thanks to the girl's wonderful idea. Otherwise, they certainly wouldn't have been able to implement it. He also said that he was incredibly grateful to her for not only being able to pay off the debt, but also solving the problem with their terrible repairs. Nadia Rada smiled again and replied that their mansion had only become brighter, and that was very good. She was happy about it, so now she could finally catch her breath. The girl began to leave and said that since all the business was finished, she would like to go to her office because she needed to resolve a few more issues. Of course, for some time it was incredibly difficult for the girl. However, having done what she had to, it became much easier for her, and she got used to it. But before entering the office, Nadia turned to Gordon and said that she had completely forgotten that she had prepared something for him. The man was genuinely surprised when he heard this. But then she said that it was a special reward for the best butler and handed him a bag of gold coins. The girl explained that he had put a lot of effort into building a farm that did not exist, so she had to thank him for it. Gordon looked at her in surprise and said that in fact it was too much money for him, and he could not accept it. He wanted the girl to simply save this money for the future and invest it in some other business. But Nadia replied that all this time their land had existed only thanks to the hard work of the servants, and efforts should always be worthily rewarded. For this reason, she gave him this reward. Smiling, she also said that he probably often felt uncomfortable in front of his subordinates because of salary problems. But now he could maintain his authority by paying them everything they needed. Gordon burst into tears again from the happiness he felt. He couldn't believe that he was so lucky and that they had such a wonderful mistress who knew about their needs and could meet them. In fact, the girl knew very well how hard it was for him because there was an annual wave of monsters, constant problems with food, and problems in the mansion due to increased debts. This man had worked very hard to keep the family afloat, so the girl knew she had to thank him. So this amount was only a small part of her gratitude for everything. Gordon, who was incredibly happy, immediately bowed and told the lady that she was a real miracle that was sent to them by the family's ancestors. The man also said that he was determined to honor and care for her throughout his life because she was the one who deserved it more than anyone else. Nadia, smiling, thanked him and said that she was very pleased, and she thought that she could never have imagined before that he could become so faithful to her. Thanks to the successful business service, the girls began to trust her, and she had to continue in the same spirit in order to finally complete her plan. At that moment, Nadia suddenly looked out the window and saw something strange. One of the knights who was riding on a horse was holding a red flag in his hands. She was very surprised by this and immediately asked what it meant, since one of the knights was also present in the room. The guy also came to the window and said that it was the speaker. Since the flag was red, it meant that the message was very urgent. Nadia was very surprised and told Fabian that since this message was urgent, she did not understand why he looked so calm. And she asked if he had any idea what could have happened. The guy immediately felt nervous because he had to somehow get out of this situation. Moving a little away from the girl, he explained that the red flag at this time meant that there was a high probability that Count Alto had crossed the border. Since Nadia was not the strongest in all these military terms, she immediately asked how this could have happened at all. In fact, the county of Alteo was located south of Winterfell, and it was not part of the Northern Commonwealth or the Father's Alliance. It was a separate force. She knew that relations between the neighboring territories were most likely bad. However, she didn't think that things could go this far. Nadia judged by the reaction of her two assistants and realized that they were definitely hiding something from her, and because of this, the girl felt a little uncomfortable. And then suddenly she screamed loudly and asked, Did they really mean at that time that they did this every year? Fabian and the butler were immediately scared because they knew perfectly well that they had to hide this information from her, but they simply did not know what to do. But as soon as Nadia saw their worried expressions, she immediately realized that she had most likely hit the nail on the head. Winterfell had no money, no resources, and the neighbors were completely crazy. Since the servants did not answer her, she made her own conclusion and realized that her work was only piling up. She soon met her husband and said that she had heard news that their neighbors were encroaching on their territory. Rutger seemed completely uninterested in all this and said that of course such things happen sometimes and said that she didn't need to worry. He also replied that he had to leave for a short while and said that he should be back very soon. Nadia, hearing this, immediately became worried. She looked at him with a sad look and asked if he, going to the battlefield, really thought that she could not worry about this. The man, of course, did not believe all these words. For some time, he simply looked at her with a cold-blooded gaze and said nothing. He sighed heavily and thought that, of course, it would be strange if she hadn't been worried when her husband went off to war. It was a completely normal and adequate reaction, so he thought that he had gone a little too far. But at that moment, Fabian spoke up and said that she certainly shouldn't have worried. He said that Winterfell's army was the strongest in the north and in the whole kingdom, so her husband was certainly safe. He also pointed towards the man and said that the gentleman was the strongest warrior in the entire army, and the low-grade soldiers of Alteo would definitely not be able to compete with him. The man didn't like this extra attention, so he asked Fabian to shut up, but Nadia heard everything she needed and immediately smiled happily. She said that it really calmed her down back then, and she realized that seeing how confident he was, she had absolutely nothing to worry about. Then she suggested that perhaps she should think about what territories to take from the enemies. And as soon as she decided to think about it, a completely different thought came to her mind. The girl realized that if he always won, then in that case she did not know where these lands of Winterfell were, the blood of the northern territories, because he no longer owned anything. And this meant that something there did not stick together. So she turned to Sir Fabian and asked if it was true that wars with Alteo happened very often. The man was a little worried, but he said that everything was correct. Then Nadia replied that they had many chances to take their lands and asked why they had not done this during all this time. The guy didn't expect such a tricky question, so he immediately became worried and didn't know what to answer her. But at that moment, Rutger spoke up and said that it was because of the fortress on the battlefield that they were winning. But as soon as they felt threatened, they would immediately hide in the belonged fortress. The girl, upon hearing this, immediately asked what it meant and asked to be told in more detail since she did not remember it all very well. Nadia had heard this name somewhere, but she didn't remember exactly. Then Fabian spoke up and said that the gentleman was absolutely right. These people were too mean. He also said that he did not want to admit it. However, the fortress of the lapdog was called a gift from heaven. When they hid there, they simply could not do anything about it and could not win. They did not come out, so the soldiers had no choice but to simply surrender and go back. Fabian sighed heavily and replied that most of the Alteo soldiers were mercenaries. But even that didn't bother them. However, they could not, of course, turn a blind eye to the fact that they were holding back their citizens who were supposed to be farming, and therefore found themselves in a rather difficult situation. At that moment, Nadia finally remembered that she knew that the Bolognese fortress was famous for being located near a rich source of iron ore. And the girl knew that if everything was so, then with the help of that method, they would be able to capture her without any problems, and thus they would be able to take even the ore source for themselves. Moreover, according to the plot of the story, Rio's dragon was supposed to be found not far from that place. In the past, the dragon's manifestation was a real disaster. However, this time, everything was really different. In fact, there was a whole warehouse of treasures in that place, and the owner was already dead. Therefore, the girl simply could not stand aside and watch what was happening. She had to take everything into her own hands. Nadia believed that he himself gave her a reason, so she was ready to act very seriously. At that moment, there was a knock on the door of the room. When the door opened, a man entered, who was one of the army's escorts. He turned to the gentleman and said that it was time to go. The guy immediately left his place inside and said that he was already ready so they could go. And as he passed by Nadia, he even glanced at her and said that he would be back very soon, so she didn't need to worry. The girl was amazed at how confident he was, speaking as if he was going to a party to have fun and not to war. The guy was a very ordinary person, without any supernatural abilities, so she didn't understand where he could get such self-confidence from. And at the moment when he was about to leave, she suddenly turned to him and, asking for forgiveness, asked him to stay for 2 minutes. She smiled at him goodbye and told him to be careful and to come back to her house as soon as possible. Rutger was a little surprised to hear this and was silent for a while. He simply looked the girl in the eyes and then said that he would do everything in his power. After that, he finally left. When he was walking down the corridor, the army commander turned to him and said that his relationship with his wife was not as bad as one might expect. However, the man was not going to admit it and said that he just imagined it. The army commander did not want to argue with him and said that surely anyone would have said the same thing, but he looked the man straight in the eye and told him not to trust her. He explained that he understood perfectly well that the beautiful, fragile girl was saying pleasant words to him, and it would be strange if he did not begin to feel something for her. However, he advised the gentleman not to believe her and not to give his heart. He told Rutger that the man himself knew perfectly well the reason why he shouldn't have done this, so he just decided to remind him. I sighed heavily, and a couple did not answer that of course he knows. However, she paid their debts, and he could not behave rudely even if he wanted to. I turn around. He started to walk away again and said that in fact, of course, he didn't trust her, so he said that the man shouldn't worry about it at all. Then the army commander agreed with him and said that in that case he did not dare to touch on this topic anymore, and they walked the rest of the way in complete silence. Several days had passed since then, and the man was already directly in the Winterfell military camp. Late in the evening, together with his assistant, he was in the negotiation room and looking at the maps that had been specially prepared to help them understand how they needed to proceed. One of his assistants said that everything was going just as they expected. Their opponents had locked themselves in the fortress. And when he asked if they needed to recall the army, Rutger did not answer. He really thought about what could be done in such a situation. The army commander looked him in the eye and said that if the man did not want to, then of course they could try to take the fortress. The Count's army had suffered on the battlefield, and they would need time to replenish their numbers. Of course, Rutger also wanted this. He understood that perhaps this would even lead to some kind of profit. However, he understood what the risks were, so he told the man that this should not be done. He did not want to risk the lives of soldiers in a battle that had a huge probability of failure. The man was of course a little upset about this, but he said that if this was what he really wanted, then of course they would accept it. However, at that moment they suddenly heard some shouts from the street. Someone was telling another person that he could not go in there and asked that the person who wanted to go out there stop immediately. The army commander immediately smiled and said that it was somehow noisy outside, so he decided to go and check what was going on there. However, Rutger said that he didn't need to do this. He wanted to get some fresh air, so he said that the man could rest, and he himself would see what was what. As soon as he started to approach the exit, he heard shouts again from one of his guards, who said that this man was putting them in a difficult situation and asked them to wait a little. At that moment, the man opened his tent, and as soon as he saw the man who appeared in front of him, he was very surprised. And all because it was Nadia. She stood and looked at him with a sad look, but said nothing. And the man was sincerely surprised, because he did not expect that she could come so far. He looked at her with big eyes, not understanding what she was doing in that place. But the girl, smiling happily, said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and she even managed to miss him a little after that, and took off the hood from her head so that she could see normally. The man immediately asked what she was doing in that place, and most importantly, why she had come. But Nadia replied that she was very glad that everything was fine with him. She was already very worried that something could have happened. But when she saw him completely fine, she immediately felt a strong sense of relief. The man was genuinely worried, because a few days ago she had wished him a happy journey. The war was going according to plan, and he was already thinking about returning home. But he did not understand what she was doing now on the threshold of his house. Of course, he had no idea what could possibly be going on in her head, since this girl, as practice had shown, was completely unpredictable. However, at that moment he thought that most likely the girl had come so far only because she was so worried about him, and he even remembered how he said goodbye to her and her very worried look before he left. For a while he silently looked at the happy expression on Nadia's face and realized that most likely this could not have happened, so he quickly threw these thoughts away. He started to return to the tent and said that they should first go inside and get rid of extra eyes and ears. The girl immediately went in, took off her cape and sat down at the table, on which there was a map with the various positions of the army. The girl took a glass of water. As soon as the man wanted to ask why she came, Nadia immediately answered that she wrote a military request. The man, hearing this, was very surprised. He immediately looked at her with an angry look and asked what she was saying. Nadia looked at him and said that she had found a way to capture the lapdog fortress. However, it seemed to her that no one believed her. As soon as the man heard this, he immediately realized that it was very stupid to assume that she had come because she was worried about him and that she had just confirmed his thoughts. However, he thought that he could even be glad about this because it irritated him so much that he could even think about it. So he decided to work on his thoughts for a while. Sighing heavily, the Rudka asked if she knew what a military request meant in wartime in general. The girl immediately understood that this was the price for a false report and the death penalty, so she replied that she knew everything perfectly well. She told the truth, so she had absolutely nothing to worry about. The military commander said that this was very good. Looking at her confidence, it seemed to him that this method could bring them victory. Echidna smiled, folded his hands on his lap, and offered to see how good her plan was. The girl immediately got up from her seat, thanked Lord Gascarda, and said that it was very valuable to her that at least someone heard her and could support her. Then Nadia said that in that case she was going to start and tell them in detail her plan of action, which she considered to be really very effective. Then she began to point to different places on the map and suggested that in one of them a mountain should be built in the west, and in another in the north a cave should be dug. She explained that the mountain would be a trap, so it should not be built to the end. And the most important thing was, of course, the cave in all of this. She said that it was necessary to place a lot of gunpowder and oil underground and set everything on fire there. When the cave collapsed, the fortress would fall with it, and then they would be able to capture all the enemies they needed at once. As soon as the man heard this, A was a little shocked, because in a situation where they did not know how to take this fortress, the cave was really not such a bad option as it might seem. He sighed heavily and said that they hadn't even thought of that. However, there were plenty of granite rocks in the area, and they had already checked the area. But Nadia, smiling, replied that they didn't need to worry about that since she had seen information about the weak point of the Belong fortress in her father's office. It was said there that there were a lot of soft rocks in the north of the fortress, so there shouldn't be any problems at all. Rutger understood that the problem with the fortress of the balloons had been a headache even for his ancestors. If they simply retreated now, it would come up again someday. He understood that if Nadia was telling the truth, then this could be a very successful business, so he seriously thought about this proposal. The girl also said that she could vouch for the materials her father had collected in case someone became his enemy. The army commander said that of course the Duke had a ZID. There must have been plenty of such papers. However, he looked into her eyes and asked if she herself was not from this family. For the man, there was not a single positive quality in the girl that he could like in her, so he always treated her with caution. The man then turned to Lord Discard and asked if the problems with the Belong fortress weren't bothering him as much as everyone else. Rutger also looked at him and said that if this girl told the truth, then this really was their chance to finally do something. Not waiting for an answer from him, he told the guy to send people to the north because it wouldn't be so difficult to check whether there really were so many of these soft rocks there. The man, of course, did not object, since it was his job to carry out orders. And at that moment, the guy turned to his wife. He told Nadia that since she was ready to put her life on the line, he did not think that she could deceive them under such a pretext. For this reason, the man trusted her, and the girl, as soon as she heard this, immediately beamed with joy and said that she was very glad that her husband trusted her. She herself thought that it was really very good that he believed her, because in this way she could very well help them all. Rutger at that moment thought about whether he really trusted her. In fact, that was not what he meant at all, but before he could even say anything, the girl suddenly grabbed his hand. She looked straight into his yellow eyes and told him to take care of himself and to consider this her decree. Meanwhile, the Lord had already gone to that area, and when he saw everything with his own eyes, he was sincerely amazed because everything the girl said turned out to be the true truth. She didn't lie to him, and when they implemented this plan, the fortress really started to collapse, so he ordered everyone else to begin the assault. When Rutgard went inside and found their commander standing in front of him with a weapon, the man was very scared and said that he had already said that he was ready to surrender. He asked the Marquis if he didn't know about aristocratic pride, And even if he was their prisoner, he was still a nobleman under any circumstances. The man asked him to follow the aristocratic laws, but Ruthgart looked at him with great surprise and asked what pride and laws he was talking about. He pulled the sword closer and said that not even half a year had passed since the Winterfell army returned from the Kalia expedition. The soldiers sacrificed themselves for the kingdom, and he, without even giving them a little rest, went and declared a new war. The man looked at him with disgust and asked, "Is this really what the guy called pride?" Of course, the aristocrat immediately became scared because he understood that this was the real truth and it was his fault. He said that after all, he had no right to kill a man of his status, so he would ask to remove the weapon from his face. However, at that moment, Nadia entered the castle and said that Count Alteo was indeed telling the truth. As soon as the men turned their heads to the side, they were very surprised. And Nadia, removing the hood from her head, replied that despite the fact that Rutgart won the war, he still could not take his life. She leaned closer to the count and offered him another alternative. The man immediately rejoiced, thinking that he was now saved. However, the girl said that after playing and being captured, Count Alteo committed suicide because he realized that it was too late. With a smile on her face, Nadia explained that this was the only way to preserve the pride of an aristocrat, and as soon as the man heard this, he was ready to simply scream in fear. He thought that this girl was a real madwoman and already regretted that she had come. He understood perfectly well that at this rate he could simply die, so he bowed his head before their feet and asked for mercy. The count said that if they allowed him to live, he was ready to give them absolutely all the wealth after that. The man handed over a piece of paper, which was a contract. He explained that it was a non-aggression pact. If the count had signed it, they could have saved his life. The man took the paper in his hands with trembling hands and began to study it carefully, thinking about what to do. Firstly, the county of Altel had to refrain from attacking the lands of Winterfell A for 30 years. And secondly, their county, as the losing side, also had to pay certain reparations. And thirdly, the slavery of Alteo had to transfer all rights to the lands of the Rhine, including the fortress of Boulogne. The man looked at this count and said that he did not even need to think about discussing any points of the agreement. There definitely should not have been. Nadia, seeing his frightened face, smiled happily and asked why he was sitting idle. He better sign this agreement quickly, otherwise they would change their minds. And so, some time passed from that moment, all the issues were finally resolved, and the warriors who were storming this tower were finally happy because it meant victory. They raised their glasses and decided that they could have fun that day. From the heart, everyone was very happy. They set a large table in honor of the victory, and many discussed this situation that happened, telling more and more details. One of the guys, having drunk a glass of beer in one gulp, laughed and said that he felt a sense of relief when they finally sorted out this protracted war for territory. His friend, who was sitting next to him, immediately agreed with him and said that the man was really speaking correctly because it had already absolutely tired everyone out. Then the conversation turned to the fact that the girl who was the mistress who suggested this wonderful idea with the assault was truly brilliant. They raised their glasses again and decided to drink to the lady in her beautiful head, which was able to come up with such a delightful idea. Rucker, who was sitting on the edge and just watching all this, was a little surprised because at first it was her idea about the thorny vine. Now the war, she helped him with absolutely many things. Of course, from the very beginning, it seemed to him that she became close to him only because she was sent to spy. But in the end, it turned out that she was completely different, and everything didn't go as the man had expected, although it turned out to be even to their advantage. The man turned to Fabian, who was sitting next to him, and asked why he hadn't seen Nadia at this feast. The guy who took a huge piece of meat into his mouth immediately said that the lady replied that she was very tired and therefore wanted to rest in her room, so she did not show up for this celebration. The girl, meanwhile, was actually sitting at her desk and thinking about what to write in the letter. She needed to somehow discreetly hint to her husband about the dragon's location. Her first option on the list was to simply say that she found it by chance while passing by, but she quickly declined since instead of the dragon's habitat, it was very deep in the mountains. The second option was to say that an ancestor appeared to her in a dream and told her about this important thing. She sighed heavily, thinking that these were truly terrible options, and she didn't know which one to choose, although she liked the second option even more. However, at that moment there was a knock on her door. She was very surprised because she had warned in advance that she had decided to rest, so she did not know who it could be. However, Nadia allowed him to enter, and as soon as she saw the man at the threshold of her room, she was truly surprised. She said hands that she thought that he was going to celebrate with everyone, so she already asked what brought him suddenly to her room. And the man replied that it was thanks to her that they were able to win, and asked if she thought that it would have been much better to go out to the soldiers personally and accept their gratitude. Nadia, after thinking about it, finally said that he was indeed right, so she replied that she could go out. Then the man extended his hand forward, thereby making it clear that he would like to accompany her there. For some time, Nadia looked at him in surprise and could not believe that this was really so. And besides, he suggested doing it herself, so she did not know what the catch was. She sighed heavily and thought that this really wasn't the best sign. However, she took his hand and said that it was time to go. As they walked along the rather dark corridors, the man broke their awkward silence and said that he heard from Fabian that she was tired and wanted to rest in the room. However, when he came in, he noticed that she was sitting at her desk and not sleeping, so he was a little surprised by her decision. Nadia, smiling, said that she could not sleep, thinking all about these new territories because finally they got them. Of course, she had to think about how they could be used properly. The girl said that she was especially interested in the mine because the production of iron ore could increase, and this would significantly improve the situation of their family. However, while she was walking, she accidentally stepped on the hem of her dress, and because of this, she tripped and began to fall. The girl couldn't keep her balance. However, it was very lucky that Rutgard was nearby. He caught her and made sure that she didn't fall to the ground. Nadia immediately thanked him with a trembling voice and also said that apparently she had relaxed too much. The witch had stopped worrying about him and his safety. In fact, the girl was a little surprised because she didn't understand why she accidentally twisted her leg and almost fell. However, she decided not to pay so much attention to it. And all because the girl was more concerned about another question. Why was Rudgard so close to her face? She felt a certain awkwardness, so she laughed nervously and said that he could already let her go. The man immediately came to his senses. He let her go and, without looking away, told her to be careful in the future because next time something worse could happen. When they went further, Nadia kept her distance from him. She did not understand what had happened because at first he had offered to walk her and now he had managed to catch her, and for some time he had been very close to her. She realized that the atmosphere between them had changed significantly, so she decided to pay attention to all this as often as possible, since she was interested in what could happen next. After some time, they finally went down and entered the hall, which was incredibly noisy because the knights, who were already quite drunk, were still discussing the situation that had happened. And Nadia, when she saw this whole atmosphere, was a little surprised because it was like a market. Everyone, as soon as they saw the lady, were very happy. They immediately ran up to her and asked why she had come after so much time. After that, some people started raising their glasses and ordering drinks, but Uriah simply greeted them and laughed nervously. The girl herself thought that she knew perfectly well that they would have such a reaction, and that was precisely the reason she did not want to come. But the man said that they were simply too happy about the end of the long war, so he asked her to understand them and not judge them too much because of it. But at that moment, Lord Geskar approached them and addressed the lady directly. He looked a little confused. He looked at her with a very sad look and said that he wanted to tell her something. And as soon as the girl saw this, she was very surprised. But Nadia was glad that he came up because she just wanted to point something out to him, so she said that she listened to him carefully. At that moment, the man fell to his knees in front of her and, lowering his head, asked for forgiveness for having so strongly doubted her and her abilities. The girl was genuinely surprised as soon as she heard this, because she certainly didn't expect this. She immediately turned to the Lord and asked him to stand up, because she understood perfectly well why he did not trust her. The girl, smiling happily, said that, as he himself had said earlier, she was from a Balazite family, so it was quite natural that she was treated in such a way. But she also said that now she was the Marchioness, and her reputation was the reputation of her husband. The girl also said that his bad behavior towards her was tantamount to damaging the reputation of his boss, whom he had served for many years. Rucker turned to Nadia and said that Lord Giascard acted this way out of deep loyalty to his family. The man also said that from that moment on, he certainly had to be more careful so that this would not happen again. But Nadia looked at him with a stern look and said that she did not intend to assert her authority only at the expense of others. So she completely disagreed with this. And that is precisely why she herself was going to give him the punishment she considered necessary. The Lord, still kneeling, said that he was well aware of how much the mistress was in his group, and therefore was happy to accept any punishment she would give him. But Nadia suddenly said in a distant voice that it would be very difficult for him to bear the punishment alone. However, if he shared it, his burden would not be so heavy. The other people, who had fallen silent at that moment, immediately looked at the lady in surprise and asked what she meant when she said to divide. One of the knights was very surprised when he heard the punishment. He could not even imagine that their mistress could be such a person. But Nadia, smiling happily, pointed at everyone present in that room and said that each of them had to be punished. And everyone without exception had to drink a penalty shot. People were very surprised at first when they heard this. But then everyone laughed loudly and unanimously. The warriors replied that they could certainly handle that, and also praised the lady, saying that she had a very good sense of humor. Nadia, meanwhile, turned to the maid and asked if she could bring them what she asked for, and also said that she was glad that the warriors were pleased with such a punishment. Meanwhile, the maid immediately began to bring into the hall many different barrels of beer. There were really a lot of them. After that, she took a huge bucket and began to pour beer into it up to the brim. The man, seeing this, immediately became frightened. They turned to the lady and asked if she thought that this was too much. But Nadia, smiling happily, said that the penalty area should have looked exactly like this. That was exactly how she imagined it. And the men were very worried because this beer had a huge alcohol content. After that, she turned to the commander and said that she was ready to pour him a drink personally to ensure that everything went well. The Lord was very surprised. However, he thanked her and had to accept this situation. The Lord understood perfectly well that everyone took this situation as a joke, but everything was not so. This girl pointed out his rudeness, attracting the attention of the soldiers. Moreover, she made everyone remember that she was higher in status than them, so the man starts drinking alcohol and realized that she was not as simple as he might have thought. He also assumed that a nobleman had indeed appeared in the north and was very happy about it. When the man had drunk everything, Nadia turned to the others and asked who would like to be next. The men immediately started raising their hands because they also wanted to test their abilities. When they started arguing about the line, the girl laughed and said that they shouldn't have done that because there would have been enough for everyone. Rutgard stood aside at this time and silently simply watched what was happening. He was truly amazed by the girl's insight and did not expect that she could come up with such a punishment. Some time passed since then, and that same evening Nadia returned to her fortress and sorted through the many different papers that had arrived in her name. She laughed and was completely sure that everyone in that family, even their ancestors, had to thank her, because she really did a lot of things. And so several days passed from that moment, and they were still in the lapdog's fortress since it now belonged to them. One day at a meeting, a girl read the papers and shouted loudly that the documents spoke about the dragon Rio. As soon as the knights heard this, they immediately became frightened. They screamed, asking what kind of dragon they were talking about, and were truly surprised. One of them almost fainted and said that they had just received the land, and immediately such a terrible problem arose that no one knew how to deal with. However, Rutgard sighed heavily and said that he had said that everything had gone suspiciously smoothly, so it was quite natural that some problems should have happened to them. He explained that because of the dragon, they would not be able to get rid of these lands for sure, and this was a problem. The knights immediately said that they had to come up with something in order to solve it. However, Nadia continues to read the document and said that they had nothing to worry about because it was written there that the dragon's master had already died a long time ago. The man, hearing this, immediately took the documents from her and asked if this was really true. The girl said that everything was exactly like that. She assumed that Count Alteo had only just received the report and had not yet had time to begin excavations, so all the rare items accumulated by the dragon now belonged to them. As soon as Rutgard heard this, he was sincerely amazed. He could not understand why such good things began to happen to him so often. After all, this had never happened before. He didn't know how this could happen because he had never been so lucky, and Nadia, seeing his expression, immediately thought that he certainly didn't believe in the kind of luck that had been happening to him lately. But it was all only thanks to her, of course. The girl shouldn't have talked about it, so she just watched his reaction. However, at that moment, Rutgard suddenly asked the girl how she could have read this document at all. Nadia looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. And the knight who stood behind said that they saw him and decided to let him through because they did not understand what Count Alteo wrote. This man's handwriting was really terrible, but the girl, as soon as she heard it, immediately panicked. She understood that she wrote this document specifically with her left hand, but she could not think that everything there could be so incomprehensible. And at that moment, she finally understood why. Throughout all these days after they captured the castle, no one said anything about it. They simply didn't understand. Nadia quickly began to justify herself. She said that her father had similar handwriting, and she had been used to it since childhood. So she decided to change the subject and suggested sending a search party there as soon as possible. The girl also said that it would be much better to find out the extent of what was happening before returning to Winterfell. The man seemed a little surprised and said that she had so many different talents. And Nadia, hearing this, immediately looked at him in surprise. She could not believe that he actually complimented her in this way. The man turned to the knight Annis and told him to quickly send a detachment to search for the dragon. After all, this could not be delayed. And when some time had passed since that moment, and the man himself went to that area, he stopped on the mountain and looked at this view and was amazed. Now this beautiful fertile land belonged to his family, and this really delighted the man because he could not even imagine that such a thing could happen. However, there was also a problem, and it was that they did not have enough farmers. Because of this, most of the fields were simply idle. One of his knights who found out about all the information said that because Count Alteo was extorting large taxes from the farmers who rented the land, people simply started to die of hunger. And this happened especially in the spring, when there was not enough food, and eventually people simply fled the county because they could not live like that any longer. Rutgart realized that at the moment when the agricultural season was about to begin, he would be able to strengthen his forces and prepare for civil war. However, even if he forced their farmers to move to this place, there still wouldn't be enough labor in such a vast area. The army commander approached the gentleman and asked him what he was thinking about bringing back the farmers who had fled the county. The lord explained that if he gave the order, the man could lead an army and turn the entire area upside down. The peasants, in his opinion, simply created their own village and lived in it. Nadia, who was standing nearby, said that if they had forced them to return, it would have greatly affected the Marquis's reputation. So she asked with a smile on her face if it would be better to use stray people. She believed that in this way they could easily solve the problem of labor shortage and no one would suffer. Rutgart came closer to her and said that it was indeed a good idea, but he had doubts whether they wanted to base themselves in that place. He explained his position by saying that even if he had lowered taxes, they would not have believed him so easily, and from the point of view of Alteo, it was a terrible territory. He said that the truth became obvious only after some time. However, when he saw his wife's joyful expression, he was very surprised. He wondered what she was thinking at that moment, but he said that he had the feeling that she probably had some idea about it, so he would be happy to hear it. As soon as Nadia heard this, she was surprised because the man himself asked her opinion on this situation. However, she did not understand why. She smiled and immediately asked if her face would really be so noticeable that she had some kind of thought. But without waiting for an answer, she said that if the man would lend her his sword, she could solve this problem. As soon as the viscount heard this, he was sincerely surprised and immediately asked why she needed his sword. In fact, it was the sword of the head of the Winterfell family, which was passed down from generation to generation. It was a family heirloom, but the man didn't understand what she was going to do with it since she wanted to take it. At that moment, the man began to take out a sword from his belt, and Nadia happily extended her hand forward, thanking him for his trust. However, he simply walked past her and handed the sword to her assistant, which surprised the girl very much and even made her wary. When she looked at him in surprise and asked why he did this, the man explained that the sword was too heavy and therefore it would be difficult for her to carry it. The man also said that Fabian could become her arms and legs, so she simply had to order him what to do, and the man would do it. Nadia was very upset when she heard this. She immediately began to protest and said that in fact, she was not so weak that she could not hold the sword. But Ruthgart, passing by her, glanced at her and said that then she seemed lighter to him than he thought. Hearing about this, the girl was very surprised and immediately thought about what kind of situation he was talking about. But then she remembered that he probably meant that day when she tripped and almost fell, and the man was able to catch her and prevent her from falling. She stood and simply watched the man. At that moment, she finally realized that, as she thought, something had really changed in him. By this time, some time had passed, and many warriors went to the tavern to have a bite to eat and drink beer after a hard day. Fabian was sitting with his friend, and he asked him if he had heard that story. The man had clearly not heard anything about it, and his friend replied that the whole village was talking about the story of Peter and the 10 bars of gold. The story goes that in the county of Alteo, one day a new owner appeared. The new head hung an interesting sign next to the gates of the fortress. All the people wanted to get the gold because the inscription said that whoever pulled out the sword of the head would be able to get this reward. However, no one could get this sword. It was a test from the head himself. That sword was not easy, and he tested whether the new residents dared to touch his things. So many thought. Some people even believed that if anyone touched the sword, they would immediately face the death penalty. And then one day, a brave young man appeared who said that he was ready to try to pull out this sword. He actually went there and tried, and people around him were saying that they were very happy that finally there was a person who could pull out this sword. But immediately after that, the head itself appeared. He, seeing the guy who pulled out his sword, immediately asked him to kneel down. After this, he actually kept his word and gave the boy several gold bars. This guy's name was Peter, and he was the only one who believed in the leader's promise and was greatly rewarded and lived happily after that, not knowing any troubles. As soon as Fabian heard this story, he was genuinely surprised. He said that it was incredible that something like this could really happen in life. His friend, laughing, said that the new head was different from Count Alteo. He was not one of those who could speak ambiguously. He also said that he heard that this story had spread to other villages and that the lapdog fortress was again filled with peasants. Then one of the men raised their glass and said that they needed to knock it out for this, because the new head had promised to significantly reduce taxes, so they believed that in the new year, they would be able to live a full life. One fine day, Nadia was sitting in her office sorting through papers when her assistants immediately began to come to her. One of them said that the head of the peasants was on his knees asking for permission to return back to them, and another handed her a paper about repairing a broken weapon. The girl was quite calm because she expected such a stir after the plan she had come up with. And it was for this reason that she, smiling, said that everything was under control, and her husband, who was not involved in most of the issues, was still surprised. He considered the girl rather strange. Rutgard did not understand how such an energetic girl, seemingly offended by her past life, could, without sparing her strength, deal with the affairs of Winterfell. He really believed that she would not take on any business. However, she had already helped him in many matters, and said that it was only out of love for him. Of course, it was hard for the man to believe this. However, he did not understand why she was not interested in him at all in that case, why she did not show any affectionate movements or tactility. And while they were sitting at their workplaces, Fabian suddenly burst into their room and shouted loudly, addressing the two of them. The man handed them the paper and said that they had finally managed to find the diagram of the Belong fortress. It had taken a lot of effort, but they had succeeded. After this, everyone immediately bent over the paper. Ruthgart noticed that the walls were very strong, and inside the building, it looked more like a labyrinth. He looked at the girl and said that the owner had been very careful and had therefore probably protected himself from the invasion of strangers who could easily get in. In fact, Nadia found this very funny, since they were still strangers, and even despite such a labyrinth, they were able to get through and capture this fortress, so they thought that his plan had definitely failed. In fact, the fortress of the lapdog was even called the Iron Fortress. Inside, there were many different secret places that they decided to thoroughly study in order to understand what was there. Nadia assumed that perhaps one of them contained the treasures hidden by Count Aldeo, and that was precisely why she insisted that they examine everything thoroughly. But in fact, she knew that despite all this, they had a goal more important than treasures, namely, in the past, Iteo, together with the gnomes, sold high-quality steel items. These could be various weapons, materials, and even household items, so the girl believed that if they resumed this production, it would greatly help them in the development of Winterfell. Some time passed since then, and now they finally explored all the secret rooms together with the man and Fabian. The girl walked between them and looked through the map again in order to check everything for sure. However, she was very upset because, even after looking through all these rooms, she did not find any traces of the gnomes, and not even a sign that they could cooperate either. The girl was so absorbed in her map that she didn't even notice Rutger stop. She hit his back and immediately apologized, saying that she was just lost in thought. But the man didn't answer her. This seemed very strange to her, and she, looking out from behind his back, noticed some kind of passage. The man said that this was somehow strange. And when Nadia asked what exactly he thought was strange, the guy replied that the path was blocked. However, there was a small gap, and the wall was a little shabby. He came closer and tried to push these things away, and indeed there was a room behind the wall, as he had expected. As soon as they went inside, Nadia was very surprised, in fact. No matter how much she looked at this place, she did not see any difference. So she could not even imagine how a man could find out about this secret passage. At that moment, Fabian looked at the map again and said that this place was not on the diagram, so he considered it all quite suspicious. But Rutgard ignored his words and simply suggested going down to take a closer look at everything. No one objected. And so, while they were walking lower and lower, Nadia, looking around, noticed that there were traces of blood on some walls. This made her very wary. The man also noticed this. However, he paid almost no attention to it. As soon as they went down, the man asked, "Why did Alteo hide the blacksmith in such a place?" At that moment, Nadia walked from side to side and saw various beautiful, expensive, and very durable swords, as well as uniforms and shields. The girl took one of the blades into her hands and noticed that it was handmade, which meant very, very hard work. Rutgard came closer to her and said that it could have been poisoned. So taking the weapon from her, he said that it was better for her not to touch anything else. The girl was a little surprised, however, she thanked him. The man, meanwhile, examining this blade, immediately thought about the fact that Alteo's weapon was of such high quality, and this dagger was much stronger and lighter than their weapon. At that moment, Fabian ran out from somewhere around the corner and turned to the gentleman and asked what those strange sounds were. He pointed somewhere in the direction from where they were coming. The man turned his head to the side and noticed that there was a door, and the guy replied that these sounds were like half-dead people, so he was very scared. Then all three of them immediately went to this door and stood for some time, listening more attentively to the sound. Nadia, looking around, thought that this was a forge hidden in the dungeon and high-quality weapons, and she assumed that behind this door there could be what she was thinking about. Rutgard turned to them and said that he was going to check it himself, and she told Fabian not to leave his mistress's side for a single step. The man was very scared. He said that only a few days had passed since they had taken over the fortress, and he was surprised that there could be any people left there. Because of his fear, his rational thinking went somewhere, and he even suggested that these might not have been people at all, but ghosts. But Rutgard did not want to listen to his senseless assumptions. Therefore, he told him to simply stay next to the lady, and he himself, having knocked down the door, went inside. And when the man approached the small cage that was located there, he was very surprised because all those people who were shouting turned out to be not people at all, but gnomes. Nadia, who followed him, was also very surprised, but not because she saw these creatures, but because of the state they were in. The girl felt very sorry for them because she did not understand what was happening there and why these poor gnomes were chained in such a terrible remote place. At that moment, one of these creatures fell to his knees and in a trembling voice asked the man to spare them. He also said that last time they committed a terrible sin, but this time it would never happen again. He was ready to swear his life. Rutgard did not understand at all what was happening. He turned to the dwarf and asked why they were all in that place. The creature looked at him in surprise and immediately asked if it was really Count Alteo who sent him. Then he continued speaking in a trembling voice and said that they just came to see the human world. And that was true. They definitely didn't want to do anything bad. As soon as Rutgard heard about this, he was amazed, because he did not expect that this count could also exploit the poor gnomes. Fabian then turned to his master and asked what they needed to do. After all, he was really confused. But the man said that he was going to deal with this personally. As soon as Nadia heard this, she was immediately surprised. She was interested in what he was going to do, and at that moment she found out what. The man came closer to this lock and was able to easily knock it down along with the doors that hid these poor creatures behind them. After that, he went inside and started to approach them closer. The gnomes all huddled in one corner because they were afraid that he could do something bad to them. And as soon as one of them saw the man swing at him, he closed his eyes and was ready to accept his fate, since he knew that he could not influence it in any way. Nadia, also seeing this, was very surprised. She ran up to him and sharply hugged him from behind and screamed for him to wait and not do this. The girl squeezed his shoulders and arms tightly, and the man began to slowly lower the sword, asking what she was doing. Nadia looked at him with a sad look and immediately said that it was impossible to kill these beautiful creatures. She also said that they were just victims exploited by Count Alteo, and he could not do that to them. But Rutgard was genuinely surprised. He looked at the girl and immediately asked why she even thought he was going to kill them. The Viscountess, hearing this, felt very awkward and asked if this was not so, and also asked why he needed a sword in that case. In fact, she really thought that he could kill them. After all, he swung with such a serious face, and she just couldn't think of anything good. But the man at that moment was able to free one of the gnomes by breaking these chains and said that he just wanted to break them. After this, when one of the gnomes was freed, the man extended his hand forward and introduced himself. He simply said his name, Glenn, and said that he was the new head of the county. The man looked really calm and asked if these gnomes could tell him everything in order what Alteo did to them. The gnome who was the leader was very surprised. However, he sighed heavily, lowered his head, and began to tell his story, saying that they themselves did not expect that this could happen. They explained that they wanted to see the world and wanted to try to create a new thing in the big world using resources and their skills. Thinking about this, they went outside. However, no one was so happy to see them. All the people, seeing them, immediately shouted that they were monsters and wanted to somehow harm them. In one of the villages, they went around absolutely all the houses, and a man who was carrying a child on himself turned to the master Miyaru, who was the leader, and said that this was already their last house. He even suggested simply going to another village since he did not expect any positive result, and understood that everything could have ended even worse. And besides, this little one who was on the dwarf's shoulders was very sick. However, they were only busy running away from people who wanted them dead and could not take care of him. No one helped them, and they ended up going into the forest to at least hide there. But it started raining very heavily outside, and they were all soaked to the skin. The other dwarves began to worry, as there was no sign that the rain would stop, and looking at the leader of the Miar, they asked what they should do. But the man himself understood that if this had continued, not only the child would have been in danger, but everyone else as well. He would very much like to be in a place where they could hide from the rain for a while. So throwing a cloak over his head, he said that he was going to go to the fortress. Miar explained that if their leader lived there, then perhaps he believed that at least he could feel sorry for them. And despite everyone trying to dissuade him, he went there. Another man also decided to go with him, and as soon as they entered the castle, they knelt down in front of his head and begged him to let them in. The gnomes asked him to help them at least until the child's fever subsided. Otherwise, it would all end very badly. Count Alteo immediately felt disgusted at the sight of them. He considered them an abomination and even thought that they might have had a serious matter. However, he did not understand who could have let these beggars into his castle. He turned to his closest assistant and immediately asked who let them in. The guy immediately replied that it was the new guard. But the man shook his head and said that he didn't need to know who. He just needed to cut off his hands and throw him out along with these offspring. Then the guard grabbed the gnomes by the shoulders and began to lead them out. The gnome began to shout at the master not to drive them out. He begged him. The guy also said that they didn't have many things with them. However, they were ready to do everything that the gentleman wanted, and he really asked the man to listen to them. But the knight took him back and asked why he was so persistent. At that very moment, a small iron cup flew out of the dwarf's pocket. The count, looking at him, was immediately very surprised. He did not understand where these gnomes could have gotten such a precious thing from, and even assumed that he had stolen it. When he told his guard to let them go, the dwarves immediately fell to their knees, and Alteo said that he was very suspicious that they had such a rare thing. After that, he leaned towards the world and asked if it was true that they had stolen her. The man immediately said that this was, of course, not true. He simply misunderstood them. They made this cup themselves, and that is why they had it. As soon as the count heard this, he immediately smiled. He understood that this was an excellent prospect for him. He didn't know where they came from, but he knew that these gnomes had excellent skills, so he thought that if they were good at making things like that, they could be very useful to him. Thus the dwarves were able to get into the fortress. Alteo said that they could stay there while doing everything he said. The count simply took and locked them in the basement in order to protect them from possible threats. They did not object, since they still wanted to stay there until their child recovered. However, when the child finally began to feel better, Mir told the master that they could already leave in that case. Alteo, hearing this, immediately became angry. He said that they were very ungrateful because he had picked them up and warmed them up. And now that they had finally become useful to him, They just wanted to get away from him. He said that their desire to leave the fortress was complete nonsense, and he didn't understand why they even had such ideas in their heads. As soon as the dwarf heard this, he was very surprised and asked if the master himself had not said that they could stay there until the baby got better if they did everything he wanted. The man explained that they had done their part of the deal, so there was no longer any need for them to stay there. While Alteo still insisted on his own, he said that since he was the head of the territory, he was obliged to protect the local residents, and if people like them broke into the village, there would be a real disaster. The man also said that while they remained in the basement, they learned how to make weapons, so he could not know what they would do with this knowledge once they left the fortress. And that is why he had to just deal with them. Of course, the gnomes did not understand what he was talking about and were amazed because the realization came that from the very beginning, he did not even think of letting them go. One of the gnomes suddenly became very angry. He told the count that all this time he had not given them any food or time to rest, and swinging a huge hammer at the man, he asked what he could possibly be talking about then. The leader of the gnomes immediately ran up to the quiet one and tried to stop him, saying that it would be better for him not to do this. However, Alteo was a good warrior and managed to throw the hammer out of the man's hands. Dihi immediately fell to the ground, and Alteo said in a very rude voice that of course he could not let go of those who tried to harm even their benefactor, so they had no right to choose. Finishing his story, the dwarf said that Ruthgard had found them imprisoned and dying of hunger. Glenn, hearing this, said that he understood everything. However, he also added that it would have been better if they had found them a little earlier. But the dwarf immediately began to protest and said that it was not his fault at all. Only the man who dragged them to that place was to blame for everything. But the viscount still insisted and said that he wanted to compensate them for all the suffering they had experienced and provide treatment until they were fully recovered. The dwarf immediately began to protest and said that they did not need money. He told him all this not in order to receive some kind of reward. He explained that they would gladly accept it for treatment and return to where they came from. That was quite enough for them. As soon as Nadia heard all this, she felt incredibly sorry, because people who did not belong to this world and who were never accepted and who betrayed Vera could no longer live peacefully as before. She understood very well how they were feeling at that moment, so she knew that she had to do something to prevent them from getting into the same situation as she once did. Then the girl turned to them all and said that she would be very sorry if they just up and came back. She explained that they had come out to see the new world, but so far they hadn't really seen anything. After all, this world was so huge, and they had just been sitting in the basement all this time. So, holding out her hand forward, the girl said that they should go with them. She wanted to show them the scale of the new world in Winterfell, and together they could experience it to the maximum. However, the dwarf became embarrassed. He understood that there was a danger that in that new place things could be even worse. No one would be happy to see them again, and they would be forced to work again. But the girl sitting down opposite him said that she could guarantee that no one else would kidnap them and lock them up. Nadia also replied that they wanted to pay them and give them vacation time so that they could explore as many areas as they wanted to. Of course, she didn't force them to go with them. If they didn't want to, they could easily refuse and go their own way, but she simply gave them that opportunity. Also, Radha smiled again, and Nadia said that she would be very happy if they lived with them, because their lands needed talented craftsmen like them. In fact, Nadia understood that her past version would also want to be consoled like this in a house where no one needed her. And at that moment, when the gnome heard this phrase about the fact that they needed them, he was very surprised. However, Ruthgard also came closer at that moment and said that he was of the same opinion. He explained that he understood very well that they were afraid that something like this could happen again. However, he tried to calm them down and told them that they did not need to worry. Glenn also said that he was the new head and could guarantee them freedom and safety. No one would ever do that to them again. At that moment, the gnomes looked at each other. They tried to understand whether they should be believed, because they really didn't want such a situation to happen. But they also had no great desire to return. After some time of silence, their leader replied that he believed that everyone thought the same and extended his hand to the girl. Nadia helped him to get up and said that it was a very good decision. She also said that first of all, they of course had to be thoroughly cured. And then they were going to talk about where they could live. Nadia, smiling, said that she would definitely take care of them so that they would not have to worry anymore. Some time passed from that moment, and Fabian burst into Nadia and Glenn's office and told the gentleman that they had completed the inspection of the iron ammunition. His eyes were sparkling, he was in uniform, and he was holding a dagger in his hands. The man said that, as the lady had said, these workers were simply incredible. But Glenn, seeing him in uniform, was immediately very surprised and said in a rude voice that he had just asked to test them and not to put them on himself. The knight replied that it didn't matter at all, because in any case the result was good, and also asked the lady how she could have thought of this, because everything always turned out as she said. The girl at that moment thought that, of course, these were not her ideas at all. However, she could not say so. So Nadia smiled and said that she had been thinking about it for a long time, but had never had a chance to check. And then they hired dwarven craftsmen and found iron ore, which was ideal for combining this. In fact, this iron armor that they were now making was much stronger than the usual one. However, this would become known a little later. The girl relied on the future of one person. She knew everything about it only because she had already lived it once, and now she could not make the same mistakes as in the past. Then suddenly Glenn turned to her and said that if they could distribute such armor among others, then the defense of their army would increase very well. At that moment, the girl tore herself away from her thoughts and, looking at her husband, said that, of course, that was exactly what she was going to do. She also said that she ran to this place specifically for this, and when they returned to Winterfell, the weapon would also become much better. The man looked at her for a while and was a little upset because she was the one whose thoughts he could not read. Some time passed from that moment, and when Nadia sat and drank her afternoon tea, she was very happy because everything was finally ready. The money she received from the dragon and the thorny vine provided territory and food in the Rhine region, and the army was fully provided with iron armor and weapons. And of course, she couldn't help but be glad that all this happened quite quickly, and she was able to help this family a little. Very soon this place was able to compare even with the South, which had always been very advanced. Then in the coming war between the North and the South, Winterfell would be able to destroy the Balasith family, and its terrible relatives would face sad last moments of life. At that moment, someone knocked on her door. It was Fabian. He turned to the lady and said that he was coming in. Then he showed her some brooches that he had brought and said that he had found them as she had asked. The girl, as soon as she saw this, immediately beamed with joy and thanked Fabina for it. The man was very proud of himself. He said that he had found the most famous master in the region. However, it was very difficult to do, so he was very glad that he had finally succeeded. Then he suddenly asked why the girl needed this at all, because he didn't think that she herself was going to use it at all, because it wasn't her style. The girl immediately took one of the brooches and, after looking at it carefully, said that it was for a gift. But in fact, she was a little excited because it was the first time she was giving a gift to someone. In her past life, she didn't have a single person of her own that she could take care of, and naturally, she didn't even receive gifts from anyone. However, suddenly Nadia thought about it and realized that it was not true after all, because once she was given something. It was a day when Karen usually got angry at her. She broke a cup of tea and yelled at Nadia, asking why the maid's daughter received more attention than she. And all because the dress that Nadia wore to the ball attracted more attention than her outfit. Although the girl did not consider herself to be guilty in that case, she herself threw her the dress as a handout. However, Nadia understood that it was better for her not to say anything at that moment, since everything would get better faster and she would calm down. Her sister screamed loudly and asked, "Did the girl really dare to ignore her? I was never happy with anything. No matter what Nadia did, she always found a way to scold her. Karen always took out her anger on her, and at some point even resorted to physical violence. But Nadia took it calmly because, over such a long period of time, she had already gotten used to it. That's why she waited for this. And at that moment, a man saved her. He stopped her and asked what she was doing. Her sister looked at the guy for a long time and told him not to interfere. But to go where he was going, it was the sister's personal business. Of course, the man was not satisfied with this answer. He immediately looked at the broken cup and then at Nadia's sad expression and understood everything. He asked in a hollow voice whether he, too, might have a personal file with her in that case. As soon as the sister heard this, she was very surprised. But at that moment, the man let go of her hand and came closer to Nadia. He addressed the girl in a gentle voice and said that he needed her. And at that moment, he took her by the hand and began to lift her from the chair. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She told Lord Jiho to wait because she thought that it was some kind of mistake or something like that. But the man simply took her and led her out of the room, thereby saving her from even greater anger from her sister. After some time, they were sitting at dinner, and the man complimented her by saying that he had been thinking about it for a long time, but the red color suited her very well. Nadia, who was sitting opposite him next to a piece of meat for lunch, immediately thanked him, but she herself did not expect such a compliment. Suddenly, he gave her a new dress and invited her to dinner, even though they were married. But even when they encountered someone special, they did not speak to each other. It was for this reason that the girl did not understand why he had suddenly changed so much. They were sitting in a restaurant, and Jiho said that this place had always been popular among lovers, and asked if she had ever been there. Nadia, looking around, said that she had been sitting at home all the time, so she had no opportunity, but now at least it became clear to her why there were so many people. The man, seeing that she had not eaten at all, immediately said that he had talked too much, so he asked her to at least eat a little before everything got cold. The girl immediately tried a piece of her dish and beamed with joy. It was truly incredibly delicious, and she was not shy about saying so. The man, smiling happily, said that he was very glad, because everyone always said that the most important thing on a first date is food, but now he could be calm. The girl, hearing the word date, immediately became even more embarrassed and told him to eat quickly too. Some time passed from that moment, and the man, when he finished his food, said with a smile on his face that he really enjoyed watching her eat. Nadia then looked at him and was a little surprised. She immediately thought about this whole incident. Her sister always found a way to humiliate her choice in a husband, and said that Lord Jiho probably didn't even know how to use cutlery. After all, they were on the same level. She also laughed and said that it was the first time she had seen a knife handled so ignorantly, and it happened the very next day after a family dinner with her sister. The nobles considered the most important thing to be how they looked in front of other people, so if they saw a Lord Jiho's poor dining etiquette, most would condemn him. Nadia turned to the man and said that perhaps her question would seem rude to him, but she would like to ask if she could lick him. The man, of course, did not object and said that she could certainly ask. And then the girl asked if it was true that he was not accustomed to table etiquette. As soon as the Lord heard this, his expression immediately changed, and the girl realized that she had said something stupid and immediately asked for forgiveness, saying that she did not want to spoil his mood. She explained that he simply came from another world, so she showed her that such a thing could really happen. The man felt very awkward, and clenching his hand into a fist said that this was indeed the case. Turning away somewhere, he also said that in his house no one looked after him, so he ate as he felt comfortable. However, now that he saw how others ate, he realized that he was doing something wrong. And what bothered him most was the fact that people now saw how he ate, and they made fun of not only him, but also the lady. Because of this, he felt very unpleasant. As soon as Nadia heard this, she was surprised and remained silent for a while. After that, she asked him if he would be against her teaching him how to do it right. The man was very surprised at the time. However, they closed this topic and spent the rest of the evening talking about something else. When it was already dark outside, the man and the girl came out of the restaurant, and he said that he had a very good time thanks to her. The guy also added that this place was really as incredible as everyone had recently said, and he was too surprised, so he wanted to ask her something. Nadia was a little worried, but she said that of course he could ask. And then the man, slowly looking at her, asked if she had ever experienced discrimination. Of course, he understood that this question could be too personal. However, Nadia looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. Lord Jiho replied that he was simply curious as to whether there was discrimination among the nobles. He explained that he thought that in their world everything was different and people only treated outsiders like him badly. At that moment, the girl thought about it and realized that if she thought about it, he was really right. Despite the fact that he had outstanding abilities, he was ignored only because he was an outsider. She was born in that world, and although they didn't love her, they knew whose blood flowed in her veins, so they couldn't sometimes break the rules of etiquette. And he was completely alone in that world, so hanging her head down, Nadia said that it was probably very difficult for him to get into this world and find himself in such a terrible situation. Jiho, hearing this, was immediately very surprised. He took her hand and said that he understood perfectly well that it was probably not easy for her either. After that, they went on, and the man asked her if she would like to meet again later. He would tell her how to read the stars. Nadia was surprised to hear this and immediately asked if there really were special ones for this method. The man looked at the sky and said that of course it was so. If you looked at the stars for a long time, you could learn a lot. For example, the weather, the area, the right time for farming. The girl thought for a moment and said that she was very interested to hear about this, and she assumed that this was what he was taught in his world. And before they parted, Lord G-Hop asked if she could wear what he had given her for their next meeting. Of course, the girl didn't object and said that she would definitely do so. And at that moment, when Nadia was sitting next to these brooches, she realized that she had now succumbed to completely useless memories of her past life. The girl believed that she needed to forget about all this, because it didn't matter at all what happened. In the end, he also betrayed her, like her entire family. Just as much as she trusted him, he hurt her, and now Nadia could no longer fall for all these provocations. She decided to put these memories as far away from herself as possible in order to not make mistakes anymore. Quite quickly, news that the Marquis of Winterfell had captured the lapdog fortress reached Nadia's father. Of course, he was very angry, and crossing himself at his assistant, asked what this idiot Alteo could have done to have his most powerful fortress taken away from him. His assistant replied that according to rumors, Winterfell dug a tunnel under the fortress and blew it up so they could easily get inside. Hearing this, the man was very surprised. He did not raise how the man could know the exact location of the soft rocks in order to destroy the walls. He knew that a simple marquis definitely couldn't know such secret information and immediately thought of his daughter. The man noticed a pattern in which after Nadia married the Marquis of Winterfell, luck was constantly on her side. He didn't know if it could be just a coincidence. However, he believed that it was imperative to be on guard. Near the fortress of the lapdogs were the most fertile lands of the Rhine, a place that was able to withstand even the south. The Duke knew that it had remained untouched Alteo since they had periodically confronted Winterfell in the wars, and he simply did not have the resources. The Duke sat down in his chair again and asked if there had been any news from Nadia up until now. His assistant replied that this was indeed the case, and the First Lady never contacted them. But smiling nervously, he asked if it was bad that Lord Jiho succeeded in the military campaign of Gadabira. At that moment, everyone in the capital was talking about him. As soon as the Duke heard this, he immediately remembered all those rumors that said that he was a dragon slayer, so he sighed heavily and calmed down a little. He told his assistant that it really made him so happy that at least he was doing his part. However, he still had a rather bad feeling. He believed that he had to find out everything for sure so that no unpleasant or unexpected actions would occur. He asked his assistant to bring paper for writing because he had to find out about the well-being of his daughter, whom he had not seen for a long time. Quite a lot of time has passed since then, and Glenn, along with his charges, was heading back to Winterfell on Earth. Soon they finally saw the edge of their lands. It was the village of Topu. This area was really on the outskirts, and as soon as people saw him, they immediately applauded and greeted the man with joyful cries. They were really happy to see him. It was a village where poor people lived, and people were happy when they saw the gentleman himself. And after they noticed a huge cart with various fruits and food, everyone immediately froze. One girl looking at this cart with expensive fruits was very surprised and could not believe that he really had it. The child immediately tugged at her hand and asked what all these things were. He had never seen them. However, they looked very bright and even delicious. He immediately said that he would really like to try them because they really looked attractive. But at that moment, a carriage stopped next to them, and Nadia got out of it, asking them to wait a little longer. The people seeing the lady were very surprised. But the girl then came up, took a beautiful, huge red apple, and handed it to the boy, telling him to try it. Smiled and said that they had only a few of them that day, but soon they would be able to eat them all the time, so they shouldn't be upset. The boy, as soon as he held this beautiful apple in his hands, cried out loudly and asked if the girl had really given him this valuable fruit. He immediately began to thank the lady and even hugged her. And Glenn suggested that everyone rest a little in this village since the road was really very long. In fact, just a few months ago, because of hunger, it was hard to see a smile on all these people's faces. But in that short time, the situation improved significantly, and these people were incredibly happy that they could finally eat normally. Glenn thought that when they returned to the mansion, he thought that they should properly thank whoever came up with this idea. At that moment, Nadia came up to him and said that the day had finally come when they were already returning to the mansion. She smiled and asked if it was true that time flew by rather quickly, and she didn't even notice how it passed. As soon as the man saw how her hair was blowing in the wind and how beautiful she looked in that pink cape, He couldn't take his eyes off her and didn't even say anything. Nadia, seeing his gaze immediately, was oh so surprised. She even assumed that she had something on her face, because he had never looked at her so intently before. Then in a sadder voice, the girl said that she just wanted to tell him something before they left. And in a quiet voice, she said that when they arrived at Winterfell, she would like to say something about their procession. Well, the man didn't listen to her at all. He didn't understand why he hadn't noticed before that the girl was quite beautiful. And besides, she was not at all like her father, not in appearance, not in character, of course. He thought that she was not bad with herself. However, he could not help but assume that she could change his life so much. Then suddenly Nadia, seeing that he had not heard her at all, moved closer to him in two and asked if he could even hear what she had said to him. The man immediately asked her for forgiveness and said that he had been thinking and so asked her to repeat it. With a heavy sigh, Nadia said that she was talking about the ceremony of returning to Winterfell, namely about his place in the procession. Glenn immediately came to his senses and said that he had completely forgotten. He explained that she was supposed to enter the territory with him. But the girl replied that she had just wanted to tell him in advance that she did not want to be seen, so she thought it would be best to simply stay in the carriage. But the man, hearing this, was sincerely surprised and said that the success in this war was only her merit, and that the people should in fact see her and thank her. But Nadia said that she had spoken about this, and if rumors had spread that she had returned with him on the same horse, then her father would have immediately begun to suspect her. She could start being called a double spy, and therefore she would not want that to happen. Smiling, Nadia said that someday they would use what their father trusted her with, so they better keep that opportunity. After listening to her carefully, Glenn said that he believed that it was not necessary to go to such lengths. It was true that he and the Duke were political opponents, but he was her family. He explained that he would never ask her to stab a member of his family in the back, and that he had no intention of involving her in his relationship with the Duke. Nadia, hearing this, immediately became indignant and said that all this was not so, he misunderstood. And the girl explained that in the near future, a serious confrontation was to begin between the North and the South. She thought that she herself, of course, guessed about this. And lowering her head down, she said that if she suddenly had to choose between the two of them, then of course she would choose Glenn. As soon as the guy heard this, he was genuinely surprised for a while. He just looked at the girl, not understanding if she was really saying this seriously. But then, turning away, he began to walk in the other direction and said that perhaps she thought so now. But if she had harmed the family with her own hands, it would have been a scar for her whole life. In other words, he had no intention of involving her in the war between them. Nadia, nervous, laughed and thanked him for such words, but said that it was not difficult for her to help him. Smiling, she said that she really liked him and she wanted to sincerely help the man she loved. As soon as Glenn heard this, you looked at her again in surprise. The wind began to flutter her hair in a strange way, and because of this, she became even more attractive. The man understood that this would not lead to anything good, so he turned around and started to leave. He did not understand. Did all the Southern girls really confess their feelings so easily? And they even said it so beautifully. He was very embarrassed. His ears even turned red. He replied that he understood her, so it was time to go. So he asked the girl to get into the carriage already. Nadia did not object. She went there and said that they would see later, and she herself tried to understand whether it seemed to her that the man was embarrassed after her words about love. The more she looked at him, the cuter he always became, so the girl went back to the carriage so that there would be no unnecessary thoughts in her head. At this very time, a small scandal occurred in the Winterfell mansion. Glenn's aunt turned to the butler and asked if he really couldn't leave her a seal. She couldn't believe that he was actually going to act like that. Gordon explained that he asked her for forgiveness. However, he couldn't handle the lady's seal so carelessly. The girl was even more surprised by this. She said that just a few months ago she was the one who managed the mansion, and to be more precise, they were together. However, now for some reason he decided not to trust her, but Gordon thanked her in a tired voice for her help and said that it was in the past. Now everything had changed. A mistress appeared in the Winterfell mansion, and without her permission, no one could take the seal. The woman, hearing this, immediately smiled and asked if the mansion really did have a real owner now. Gordon understood her tone perfectly well and immediately became wary, but the woman said that the truth could not be hidden. The servants were whispering everywhere that the Marquise had not been seen for several days. So she asked him to tell her Who was supposed to take charge of the family business when its mistress was so irresponsibly leaving her place? Gordon didn't even know what to answer to this. He understood perfectly well that he shouldn't have made mistakes. However, he was confused. The woman burst out laughing and asked him if he thought it was too suspicious that she had disappeared when Glenn had left. So she believed that she must have run away while she had the chance. And she was absolutely certain that something bad had happened in Winterfell. She also looked at Gordon and asked if he had completely forgotten what family she was from. The man lowered his head and said that he understood her concern perfectly well. He didn't want to say it, but the lady was now with the gentleman. As soon as the aunt heard this, she was amazed and asked in a trembling voice if she was really with Glenn. The woman did not understand at all, since when they had been together and screamed and said that even if that was the case, it did not make her less suspicious. She also said that no one knew what cards she had up her sleeve. She could have set them all up without blinking an eye. The butler did not like this behavior at all, and he said that perhaps it was so, but as far as the household was concerned, the lady had to deal with it personally. The woman was amazed. She could not believe that this girl was able to make the butler unquestioningly take her side. Then she screamed and asked if Glenn hadn't sent her back yet, and she had definitely been bothering him there the whole time. Gordon explained that they were supposed to return very soon, so the woman could ask him herself, since he didn't know such details. When the aunt heard about this, she immediately asked what he meant, and the man simply repeated in a calm voice that the gentleman should soon return home. Very soon this really happened. It was already quite late on the street, and the Marquis and his assistants were met by servants with welcoming cries that they congratulated him on his victory. His aunt also came out into the yard and, seeing the man, immediately said that she was very relieved that he was able to return home safely. When the man jumped off his horse, he asked if she really had come out to meet him. However, he simply stated the fact that he had returned. Auntie kept smiling and said it was incredible. It was truly a huge achievement, and she was genuinely happy for them. Then she saw Nadia behind the man and said that she was very glad that the Marquise was also okay and that she had come with him. She also said that she was very surprised to hear that she left the mansion and went to war, because she did not understand how the girl could go to such a dangerous place on her own. The woman herself said this phrase because she wanted to hear how Nadia was going to justify herself. The girl was very embarrassed and surprised. She was silent for a while and simply did not know what to answer. But then she made a sad face and said that she just missed the Marquis so much that she couldn't stand it anymore. So despite the danger, she went there. His aunt was very surprised. She could not understand what kind of nonsense the girl was saying. The other knights, hearing this, considered this act very romantic. Glenn, as soon as he heard this, became very embarrassed again. His ears turned red, and he did not understand why these words now always had such an effect on him. But the aunt was not happy with this. She could not believe that the girl decided to get out of this situation in this way. She did not give up on Nadia and said that if she loved the Marquis so much, she should have thought about his situation. And the woman asked, did she really not even suspect that her presence on the battlefield could only hinder him? The girl, lowering her head down, immediately said that she was indeed right, and also called herself stupid. At that moment, a guest card approached them and addressed the lady. She was immediately glad to see him and thought about what a devoted person he was, how he would say something useful. She really believed that he definitely had some resentment about her coming to the military camp, so she was absolutely sure that he would say something good. However, there was a card that addressed her in a very rude voice and told Mrs. Grace to watch her words. He explained that there were a lot of eyes around, and so she had to be nice to the Marchioness. Grace, hearing this, was sincerely surprised. However, there is a card that makes it clear that the Marquise put herself in danger because of concern for her beloved husband. He also explained that on the battlefield she was responsible, so the woman did not have to worry about it. The woman could not believe that it was not someone else but Sam Giscard who was protecting her daughter Balazet. She believed that such a thing could never happen. Other knights also began to defend Nadia and said that she only helped the master on the battlefield because as soon as he saw her, his strength immediately increased. Grace looked at her nephew and thought that they had all gone crazy. They had all ignored her recently because they thought she was a spy. But Glenn turned to his aunt and hugged Nadia and said that although they were relatives, his wife was now the mistress of Winterfell, and therefore she should not forget elementary things like respect. And at that moment, when his aunt saw this, she was ready to faint, because she certainly did not expect such behavior from her nephew. Glenn then turned around and started walking towards the mansion, saying that they were very tired after the long journey, so they decided to leave. Grace was left standing aside, very angry. She couldn't believe that the clan was covering for the Balazite daughter and then shamed her in front of everyone. The woman believed that something had really gone wrong and that something was wrong. So she decided that she absolutely had to find out what exactly had happened. She even thought that if everything continued like this, very soon Nadia would finally take power for herself, and she was not at all happy with that. After all, she understood that when the girl seized power and also gave birth to an heir, her position would be significantly weakened. Grace believed that she could not allow this to happen under any circumstances, so she had to fight to the end. Some time passed from that moment, and Nadia finally came to her room like this. The first thing she did was lie down on the bed and exhale with relief because she was incredibly tired. The girl turned on her side and thought that playing a fool in love was much harder than winning the war. Therefore, she really needed a rest. However, then she remembered Glenn's face and how he defended her in front of his aunt, and she assumed that his attitude towards her had actually softened. And besides, the people of Winterfell took her side so quickly. She certainly didn't expect that, but she was glad that her efforts were starting to pay off. At that moment, someone knocked on her room door. It was her maid. She asked the girl if she needed to heat water for the bath. Nadia was immediately delighted by this and said that of course she would like this, and also asked that the rice maid come to her for a minute. And as soon as the maid came in, Nadia handed her several brooches. The maid immediately became embarrassed and asked the mistress what they were. And Nadia explained that the Rhine region, which was located in the Boulogne fortress, was known not only for the production of iron ore, but also for glass. And she brought it thinking about her, so she asked her to pass it on to Yura and Aiden too. The maid was very worried and said that these were very valuable things for them, so she simply could not accept them. However, the lady smiled and said that they were not that valuable. They were not jewelry, but just glass items, so she did not need to worry. Smiling, Nadia also added that as soon as she arrived in Winterfell, the maids helped her a lot, so she wanted to thank them in this way. One thing she created when she returned to the past was that she realized that it was not worth trying to look better for people who hated her anyway and would definitely not change their attitude. She realized that it was much better to spend this time taking care of her people and her environment, who truly valued her and were ready to do anything to help her. The maid really couldn't believe that she had given it to them. However, she still accepted the gift and thanked her with all her heart, saying that it was very valuable to her. She gave them to the other maids, and one of them, smiling happily, said that it was the first time she had met such a lady. She was very kind and caring, always thinking about their well-being. Another agreed with her and said that according to the butler, she did her job very well and thought it was simply delightful. However, she was very worried about their master because she believed that he was not at all interested in their dear lady, who was simply beautiful. The maid, bursting into tears, said that even after their joint trip, they continued to use different rooms. The lady, out of longing for him, even went to the Boulogne fortress, although it was very dangerous. Her partner replied that this was indeed so. Their mistress was so faithful and good, and she had a wonderful character, and they did not understand the gentleman, since it was rare to find such a person in their time. Another maid agreed with her and said that although the mistress did not show it, she was very sad at heart. The last time, when he refused to spend their wedding night with her, she cried so much. The maids knew perfectly well that they had to solve this problem somehow, and so one of them suggested an idea, which everyone else happily agreed to because they thought it was brilliant. When evening came, Nadia went to the hot bath, which the maids had already prepared for her by that time. Having dipped her feet in this wonderful warm water, she was already happy. In fact, she thought for a long time, why did the maids have to take so long to prepare her bath? It was quite unnatural because usually they got it done very quickly, but now she realized that they had paid more attention since she had been gone for a long time and had decided to prepare a simply perfect bathroom. And when Nadia completely immersed herself in the bath, she immediately let go of all the anxiety and fatigue that had accumulated in her over all that time. However, some time passed since that moment, and the door to the room suddenly opened. The girl did not immediately understand this. However, she simply felt a chill on her bare back that came from this. Nadia immediately turned her head to the side to understand who it was that came in. She assumed that most likely it was the maids who came to help her take a good bath and wash her body. However, the girl was incredibly surprised as soon as she saw the silhouette of the man who entered. It was not a maid at all, it was a male silhouette. And this person was not just any man, it was her husband, Duke Glenn. He was wearing only a robe, underneath which you could see his muscular chest and abs. His body was truly beautiful. However, as soon as the girl saw him, she immediately screamed loudly and began to cover her body with her hands. She looked at him without understanding what he was doing there. The girl really couldn't believe that he could come into the bathroom while she was there. And because of this, she felt even more discomfort, just like the man himself. Glenn just stood there for a while, looking at her with a worried expression. However, when he realized that he was staring, he quickly turned away. After clearing his throat, the man admitted that he himself actually did not know how this could have happened. He explained that he was simply told to use this bathroom because his own needed renovation, and he was completely unaware that the girl had occupied it first, so he apologized for causing her discomfort. However, as soon as Nadia heard all this, she immediately understood what had happened. She thought that the maid was talking about how she could rely on her. She simply approached her work responsibly. But the girl really couldn't even imagine that she could have set something like this up. And besides, looking at Glenn, it was a little funny because it was the first time she saw him so embarrassed. Smiling, Nadia said that it seemed to her that the servants decided to play a little joke on them, and that was why such a misunderstanding happened between them. The girl also asked if he could come into the room and wait a little. She would finish very soon and leave. The man said that of course he was going to do that, and before leaving he added that he was definitely going to make sure that the culprits were severely punished because it was impossible to do that. But Nadia, smiling, told him not to do this. After all, they did it with good intentions. They just thought about it and decided to take care. Hearing this, Glenn stopped in front of her and looked at her in surprise for a while, not understanding what she meant. However, after that, he turned around and began to leave. Nadia decided to just turn around and continue to rest while taking a hot bath since she considered this problem already solved and did not worry. However, Glenn left me so quickly that he stopped and thought that most likely during all this time, he looked so insensitive that even with services he had to come to such a decision. So he decided to change his mind and return to the bathroom, took off his robe and unceremoniously climbed into the hot water next to the girl. Nadia, seeing him next to her, was very surprised and also embarrassed. For some time there was complete silence between them. She didn't even know what to say. But then she smiled and asked if he had changed his mind and decided not to leave. Glenn looked at her with a stern gaze and said that if he went out now, there would be rumors that he had rejected her again, and she would thus be in a difficult situation. Nadia, hearing this, was very surprised because it meant that he was thinking about her and did not want to put the girl in an awkward position. So she smiled and said that she wouldn't mind him staying and decided that he could stay with her for a while and then go out. She actually thought it was no big deal, and she also thought he was really cute when he tried so hard to maintain his status. After a short silence, Nadia moved closer to him and said that since it had already happened, she would like them to help each other wash like real spouses. The man suddenly blushed even more. He turned away from the girl and said that it was not that he did not want it, but he simply did not think that it would be a good solution. But his wife was no longer listening to him. She suddenly noticed the scars on his chest and immediately reached out to him, asking when he suddenly got them. After all, she hadn't noticed them before. Glenn had a very good reaction, so he hit her on the hand and told her not to touch. The girl immediately moved away and asked for forgiveness, saying that she really was too close. But the man, sighing heavily, said that he really did not understand why she did not keep her distance at all in the situation they found themselves in, but continued to sit very close to him. Nadia moved even further away and said that she was just worried. It seemed to her that he could have been in a lot of pain, so she would like to know how it happened and maybe even help. Glenn became even more embarrassed because of this. He no longer looked into her eyes because he understood that it was too awkward, and even thought that it would be much better if he just left. But then he suddenly glanced at her and realized that he could not take his eyes off her. This girl was too beautiful and pretty that his heartbeat accelerated every time he looked into her beautiful green eyes. Some time passed between them from that moment. All this time there was a tense silence. It was broken by Nadia, who suggested talking about something else in order to while away their time. She said that so much had happened in that short time, and she felt it was quite necessary to discuss everything. Glenn looked at her cautiously and then said that he realized during this time that he had not yet had time to officially thank her for everything she had done for him and his country. After all, it was thanks to her that their lands became much richer. Winterfell was always limited in resources. They did not have enough food and minerals. However, now they had all of this, and even more. In addition to all of this, they had a powerful army, so he was sincerely grateful to her for everything she had done. Nadia, hearing this, immediately smiled and said that she was always happy to help her beloved. But in fact, she was really very pleased by these words. And all this because for the first time someone recognized her. She felt very happy in her soul, and she could not stop smiling from this. Despite his face, she said that she was also grateful to him. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and immediately asked what she was grateful to him for. And Nadia, finally looking him in the eye, said that she was grateful to him for marrying her. And again, when Glenn saw her look, his heartbeat accelerated, his whole face turned red. He felt incredibly awkward and couldn't do anything about it. Some time passed from that moment. They finished taking a bath and the two went to dinner. The maids who served them, whispering to each other, realized that they had had quite a good time together, since they had stayed in the bathroom together until dawn. The girls were genuinely pleased because they believed that their mission had been a success, and they believed that they had done everything right. Nadia really looked amazing. She was quite fresh because she had slept well and taken a good bath, which could not be said about Clay, who for some reason could not sleep. When he finished his dinner, he stood up from the table and said that it was time for him to go. After all, he had a meeting planned and an inspection of the territory. But then suddenly the maid intervened in the conversation and, turning to the gentleman, asked whether perhaps he should have taken the mistress with him on this inspection of the territory. As soon as Nadia heard this, she was immediately glad that Risa had taken such an initiative, because now she wouldn't have to ask for it. The maid explained that they hadn't been there for a long time, and besides, a huge market had opened there that day, and there was a lot to see. The man was not at all happy with this idea, however. Nadia decided to help him a little. She thanked the maid for her concern and said that she also had to deal with the things she had been putting off that day. And when the girl was about to say that she could no longer go either, the man suddenly extended his hand forward and offered to go together. As soon as Nadia heard this, you were genuinely surprised. But after some time, they were packed up and headed straight to the city to inspect the territory. Indeed, as the maid said, they had arranged a fair there, and Nadia, when she walked around, could not take her eyes off it. She heard that there were a lot of people there. However, imagine that she could not imagine that there could be so many. The man suddenly looked somewhere behind him and said that the Rhine region had joined Winterfell, and that was why the festival had begun. He also noticed that the knights who accompanied them were lost somewhere behind in the crowd and could not catch up with them since there really was a huge number of people. People who suddenly noticed the girl who sadly stumbled and took off her hood immediately realized that it was the lady. However, not everyone thought so. Some thought that she simply looked like her because the lady would definitely not wear such cheap clothes. It was clearly not her style. People argued about this for quite a long time. However, behind him, the man who saw the girl immediately recognized her and was incredibly amazed. Glenn immediately helped her pull the hood back onto her head and, looking around, said that since there were a lot of people that day, it could be very dangerous. He also said that even the guards had already managed to get lost in the crowd, so he suggested simply returning home and coming again on a less crowded day. At that very second, the man who saw Nadia ran towards her with a barrel in his hands and called her a spawn of Balazit. He started pouring the contents of the dirty barrel on the girl and said that it all happened because of her. He looked really downright mad. Nadia was then incredibly scared. She was overcome with shock and could not do anything about it. The girl just stood in one place and did not move because she did not expect this. But at that moment, Glenn, who was standing next to her, had a very good reaction. So he was able to knock him to the ground much faster than the man reacted and prevent him from doing what he wanted to do. This stranger was very shocked and he screamed loudly as the guy hit his head on the ground as well. But Glenn looked at him with an icy gaze and asked who he was anyway, since he really didn't know him and didn't understand why he had such a strange attitude towards his wife. The man, who found it difficult to even move, told the master that this girl was the daughter of Balazit, the worst enemy of the north. He told the gentleman that he should not allow himself to be fooled, and he also said that because of this terrible family, his dear and dear brother just went and died. So he really hated the girl with all his soul. The man continued to shout and replied that they didn't even know how to fight properly, And they also put their soldiers on the front lines, and his dear brother died, and that's precisely why he didn't understand how this could happen. Nadia, who was really scared because of everything that was happening, just stood there. She was amazed by what this man said, and the people around began to talk among themselves. They understood that they were talking about the lady. However, they did not understand how the guy could accuse her in this way, because she had already done so much for their Winterfell. Then a worried woman ran out of the crowd, fell on her knees before the gentleman and asked for forgiveness, and also wanted them to be spared. The woman explained that her son had made a huge mistake. He had always been a sickly child and had stayed at home. The old lady looked Glenn straight in the eyes and said that after the death of his only brother, on whom he could rely, he still could not come to his senses. So she really asked for mercy. The woman also bowed her head to the ground and said that her first son, Henry Clark, died in battle during the potassium expedition, and that it was not the lady's fault at all. They all understood this perfectly well. She said she knew that the lady's frank honors would be severely punished, but in memory of her first son, she would very much like him to spare them. Glenn really wasn't heartless, so throwing the man into his mother's arms, he sighed heavily and said that he remembered Henry Clark. The woman, upon hearing this, immediately asked what he meant, and the man explained that this man was the one who fought more bravely than the others on the front lines. And all this was for the sake of Winterfell. He died as a hero, and he had a worthy death. So the man always kept the memory of him in his heart. As soon as the man heard what he was saying about his brother, he again could not contain his emotions and began to cry very hard. He was really having a hard time dealing with his loss. After that, his mother burst into tears, and since she also could not calmly cope with the death of her first son, they began to hug and the people around began to disperse since the concert was over. The man meanwhile glanced at Nadia, who ran closer to him and already wanted to say something. The girl really looked at him with a pitiful look and said that everything was fine with her. So she suggested that I make a problem out of all this and not even discuss the situation that had happened since she didn't see the point in it. Smiling, she said that she was indeed fine, and pointing to her body said that she herself could see that she was not hurt in any way, and not even a drop of water fell on her body. For a while, Glenn just looked at her, and then he looked towards the woman and said that since his wife said she was fine, he could let them get away with it for the first time. But the man also leaned closer to her, put his hands on her shoulders and told the woman that it must have been incredibly hard for her all this time. And that is why he said that he was really very sorry and he regretted losing her. The woman then burst into tears from happiness that her second son would not be executed and thanked the gentleman for his generosity and kindness. After that, she hugged her son and they went home. After what they had experienced, they needed to drink a cup of hot tea in order to come to normal. Nadia, who was watching them, thought that during all this time she had forgotten how strong the hatred in these parts was towards the people from Balazit. And it was quite obvious. She shouldn't have been surprised because her father had done a lot of bad things. And if she had solved several of their country's problems, then the situation certainly couldn't have improved so quickly. The girl began to feel sad because of this, and Glenn noticed this, but decided not to disturb her and not to interfere, because he believed that she just needed to experience these emotions. When night fell and they had already returned to the palace, the girl sat late in her office sorting out papers. Fabian came to her and said that it was already quite late and it was time for her to sleep. And at that moment, when she tore herself away from her desk and looked around, she noticed that it had indeed become completely dark outside. She was surprised that so much time had already passed. She said that she wanted to work for a little while longer. The girl also said that they could have left on their own because she did not want to detain them. Fabian began to protest. He wanted to tell her something, but the girl interrupted him and said that she did not want to sleep yet, and also promised that she did not intend to stay up for long, so they should not worry. The men were surprised, but after asking for forgiveness, they left, and on the way to the room, they continued to discuss the situation. His assistant, who was walking next to him, said that he was really grateful that the lady tried so hard for the sake of the residents. However, he thought that she was a little overzealous. Fabian agreed with her and said that she was more like someone who needed something to do to get her mind off her surroundings and just lose herself in it. And in fact, it was really true. Nadia was dissolving in some business. It was much easier to live. She felt more confident and could, at least for some time, not think about anything. When the next morning came, Glam, as always, was at his training. And then suddenly, cutting through one of the dummies, he remembered what happened the previous day. He stopped and looked at the pieces of wood that had fallen and immediately remembered what that most terrible man had said about his wife. Of course, the losses of the North were huge because ZID had put their people on the front lines during the expedition. However, he did not think that this was the end of it. The man was incredibly angry and continued his training, taking out all his energy there because the Duke of Balazite was not only his enemy, but also his parents. And Nadia was his daughter, but she had nothing to do with all the evil that her father did. It was not the girl herself who gave these orders and forced people to die. The man understood perfectly well that Nadia, on the contrary, wanted to help them. And if it weren't for her help, Winterfell would not have been able to prosper as it did with her arrival. She was no longer their enemy, but only a blessing. However, the fact that she was a member of the Balazit family certainly did not disappear. And Glenn even thought for a while that the girl herself enjoyed how her father hurt his parents and walked over innocent people. All these thoughts took over his head so much that he could not do anything about it. The man threw the sword aside and grabbed his head because he felt disgusted. After this, Glenn was about to leave when suddenly the voice of his assistants was heard from behind, and they were very surprised to see the gentleman, because he usually did not come to training so early. One of the guys, seeing his expression, said that lately he was constantly with the lady and had not been seen here for quite a long time. And his partner, smiling, said that his face had become so beautiful that he assumed that it happened because they were both newlyweds and were doing various marital affairs. As soon as Glenn heard this, he looked at the man with a very stern, but at the same time very tired look. The man realized his mistake and said that he took his words back, after which another of the knights asked if everything was okay with the lady. After all, they were really worried about her. But once they saw his expression, they couldn't understand why he became so gloomy as soon as they mentioned Madam. The knights thought that this had never happened before, so something had changed. One of them even thought that this happened because he still could not accept the feelings of Mrs. Glenn, who was standing a few meters away from them, heard all this, and sighed heavily. Then one of the knights turned to the Lord and said that no matter how passionate love was at one time, the feeling would still cool down. And if the man continued in the same spirit, then later he would definitely regret this decision. Glenn was very surprised to hear this. However, he did not answer. Then another knight spoke up, also speaking in defense of the lady. The man said that of course no one else would love him so sincerely because everyone knew what kind of reputation he had in society. So he was absolutely sure that the lady's feelings were genuine. For some time, the men tried to convey to him the idea that the mistress was a wonderful option for him, and yet the man, unable to bear it, said that he himself knew all this very well. He explained that Nadia was too good for him and, hanging his head down, sighed heavily. One of the knights shouted loudly and said that it really was so. She was smart, beautiful, and most importantly, she sincerely loved her husband, so they did not understand what his problem was. He did not answer them, but only thought that if he had fallen in love with her, he did not know what would have happened to his mother and bedridden father. He didn't intend to blame Nadia for all of her father's crimes. However, to half love the daughter of the one who killed his mother was a completely different matter. And it was for this reason that he simply could not accept her feelings. So he even decided that he should never have done it, even if he wanted to. When he started to leave, Fabian suddenly ran up to him and said that the lady had invited him to have lunch together if he was not busy. The man hearing this was genuinely surprised because he didn't think that she would suggest wearing something like that. Of course, he couldn't refuse such an offer, and after some time they sat in the dining room in awkward silence and had lunch. Nadia assumed that the man was still thinking about the situation that happened on the street the previous day, and that was what was really bothering her. She believed that what happened then was a mistake, and she even felt some guilt because she was unable to stand up for herself. So the girl broke their silence first. She turned to him and said that she understood that the residents did not trust her because she knew why her father had a bad reputation. And suggesting that he might be worried about her, she said that he absolutely shouldn't have done this because she was completely fine with it. However, Gwen sighed heavily and suggested not to talk about it because he really didn't want the girl to hear this. Of course, she was surprised. However, she didn't argue. She knew that they couldn't just leave it like that, and she would really like to somehow diffuse the situation between them so that everything would return to normal. After a long silence, she looked at him and said that they were married, And if something happened, she thought it was best to talk about it and find out where people stood. She also asked if he remembered how she said that she would choose him if the choice was between him and his father. The man hearing this immediately became wary, but Nadia continued. She said that it was not just like that. In fact, her father had a difficult relationship with each other. But the girl did not have time to finish her sentence because the man shouted very loudly and said that he had had enough. In addition to all this, he hit the table with his hand very hard. The girl was very scared, seeing and hearing all this. She even began to tremble a little. Gwen understood her mistake perfectly well, sighing heavily. He asked for forgiveness and said that he didn't mean to snap at her. It just happened that the last few days had been pretty stressful. Well, Nadia quickly came to her senses and smiling said that everything was fine. She understood that he was worried, so she suggested that he let her know when he was ready to talk to her. She lowered her head, became a little sad, and said that she would definitely look forward to this time. Gwen felt a little guilty at that moment because it wasn't her fault at all. She was just the daughter of the one who killed his mother, so he couldn't just forget about everything and move on. But even despite all this, he really liked her. And the man understood that he himself was to blame for everything, as well as for the fact that he could not keep his emotions to himself, and because of this, he frightened the girl. Immediately after lunch, Nadia went to her office in order to once again immerse herself in completing various tasks and not think about what had happened. However, Fabian ran up to her and asked the lady to stop. The girl looked at him worriedly and asked what had happened, because she saw how nervous he was. The man was a little worried. He told the lady that the gentleman had upset her, but he explained that the man had just been training all day and had not even returned to his office. Nadia, hearing about this, lowered her head. She had some thoughts about this, but she did not voice them. Then Fabian continued and asked the lady to listen to him. He asked if she knew about the disaster that happened to his parents. As soon as the girl heard about some disaster, she immediately thought about it. She assumed that he was most likely talking about the fall of the carriage from the mountain ridge, in which the Marquise's mother Glenn died then. And his father had not been able to recover from a serious injury until then, and so he was practically immobilized. Fabian looked at the lady and said that the culprits of this disaster were her father. The girl, lowering her head down, said that she understood everything. Yes, in fact, Nadia became beautiful. This information was definitely hated by the Marquis, and he did not even try to hide it. The man came closer and said that the gentleman suffered greatly even after so many years, because he fell in love with the daughter of the one who harmed his parents, and he could not behave normally around her. And he also said that it seemed to him that because of what happened in the village, his suffering only intensified during this time. Fabian looked at her with a very sad look and said that he wanted to convey to her that it was in no way because of her. In this whole situation, they could not do anything, so he asked the girl not to blame herself in any way. Nadia, hearing this, immediately smiled and thanked the man for his support. She said that she would definitely like to listen to his words, and after that, they parted. The girl came to her room and, closing the door behind her, she sighed heavily. Of course, all this time she was thinking about what had happened and what she had heard. It's not that she didn't understand why the people of Winterfell considered her father their enemy, but still, you see, it wasn't he who killed Glenn's mother and wounded his father. Nadia personally heard this from him in her past life, as soon as the news came about what happened. Her father said that the Marquis had many enemies, even within his own territory. Although this happened to any family, no one was safe. The girl, hearing this, immediately looked at him in surprise and asked if this really meant that he had nothing to do with this tragedy. As soon as the father heard these assumptions, he immediately asked if she really thought that he could use such a cheap trick. He also said that if his hand had been put into this, then there would definitely be no one left alive. Therefore, he would ask the girl not to think like that anymore. And besides, he understood that if the Marquis died, his son would take his place, and he was much better than his father, and therefore he could not read his thoughts and desires. Therefore, the man understood perfectly well that if Glenn officially took the place of the head of Winterfell, they would only become many times stronger, which would definitely not be good. And he looked at his daughter and immediately asked why he had to help this. Nadia didn't respond to this at the time, but now, as soon as she remembered what had happened, she realized that she had also heard that the Marquis's body was already stiff. She didn't think it was the aftermath of the accident. People in the South wouldn't act without orders, so they certainly weren't involved in that matter. And this, first of all, meant that someone else, like the father, was behind this and and the traitor was clearly among the people close to them. The one who could easily enter the Marquis's bedroom was the one who was trusted implicitly. That was the kind of person a traitor could be. The girl believed that she had to find the real criminal at any cost. After all, if a civil war were to start in the future, she had to gather all her strength. It was impossible to turn a blind eye to the problems within the state. However, Nadia was in despair because she did not know how she should do this. Because despite everything she had done for them, she still could not convince the people. But at that moment a maid knocked on her door, and entering said that she had just brought a letter from the Duchy of Balazit. Hearing about this, the girl was very surprised because this letter was from her father, but she immediately took it and began to quickly read it in order to understand what he was talking about there. It was written there that the letter was addressed to his beloved daughter. He wrote there that after her departure, the house was completely empty, and he wanted her to write to him more often, as they had agreed before her departure. In fact, it looked like an ordinary letter, but by the words "write letters," he definitely meant to convey some secret information. Any reasonable person would immediately be able to understand this hidden meaning, and if someone saw this letter, they would immediately think that Nadia could be in a conspiracy with her father. The girl was incredibly angry with him. I don't understand how he could just send a letter with such content. She considered it very approachable on his part. However, Nadia understood that this was a warning to her to send him information about Winterfell's weak spot, otherwise there would be consequences. The maid immediately asked if she would like to write him a reply, and also asked if she needed to prepare a paper. But Nadia said that this didn't need to be done because I still wanted her to think carefully about the answer for some time. The girl understood that she couldn't leave everything as it was, so she needed to change something, and she began to actively think about how she could best do this. At that very time, Aunt Glenn was sitting in her office when a man came to her, who always reported to her about what was happening around, and said that the man had stopped going to that girl. When Auntie heard this, she was very surprised, but the man replied that he had heard that the gentleman had been busy with work lately, and there had also been constant talk that their relationship had cooled considerably. He also said that it seemed to him that the fact that one of the local residents attacked the lady with the words that she was a spy became a rather big problem in their relationship. It was also said that this man's brother was a valuable soldier of the master, and that was why there were great disagreements between them. As soon as the aunt heard this, she immediately smiled, put her cup of tea aside, and said that this meant that there was another chance, despite the fact that he was in love with that girl. Usually all doubts began to grow from something insignificant, and since his mother's death was tied into this matter, the woman understood that it would be much easier for her to shake him. Her assistant said that the Marquis had already raked in the stick. At first he entrusted the household chores to the mistress, but now as soon as she appeared, he immediately ran away. He thought it was very scary, so he said that it couldn't go on like this any longer. He couldn't just calmly watch as the Winterfell family passed into the hands of the Balasites. For him it was a tragedy. But Auntie left everything in her place and said that he could not worry and leave it all to her. She wanted to deal with this problem herself. Then she went to the desk and immediately began to write a letter. She believed that no matter how outstanding this girl was, she certainly would not be able to last even a year in their estate. She believed that Nadia didn't know who from this family were her people, so she could calmly act in such a way that the girl wouldn't even suspect anything. After the letter was written, she handed it to the man and said that he should pass it on to her people and not forget to tell them to burn the letter as soon as they read it. When the next day came, Glenn still spent almost all of his free time on the training field. That day, the man decided to start his training with archery. He was really incredibly good at it, and he was happy. The guy was very focused and was able to easily hit the center of his target, after which he pulled the next arrow in order to do the same, but at a different target. Nadia, who stood behind and watched all this, was a little upset. In fact, the man didn't even notice her, and this was to her advantage. She felt that she needed to sort out this awkwardness between them for the sake of their own prosperous future. She was also worried that he had become afraid of her again, and this was certainly not beneficial for either of them. So Nadia approached Glenn when he had already fired and asked if he could teach her this too. Hearing this, the man was very surprised and asked if she really wanted to learn archery, because he didn't think that she could ask for exactly that. Nadia looked at him with a sad look and asked if it was really impossible to do that. Glenn turned around and started to leave without saying a single word. Of course, the girl was very upset about this. She thought that of course he was uncomfortable being around her again, And this did not surprise her at all, since this is exactly what she expected. But at that moment, the man took another, smaller wooden bow and turned to the girl. He smiled and said that since she was a beginner, she should have used a different bow, which would have been much easier for her to learn. Nadia, hearing this, immediately beamed with joy, because this meant that she could not worry. He wanted to teach her. The man placed her next to the target and told her that she had to insert the arrow and pull the bowstring so that everything was pulled very tightly for a good hit. When Nadia tried to repeat this, the man suddenly came closer to her and, putting his arm around her waist, said that it would be better for her to put her legs a little wider. That way it would be easier for her. After that, he began to move her arms higher and said that she had to stand straight and not bend her body. He touched her palm and said that she had to pull the bowstring to the limit so that the blow would be more precise and powerful. Nadia, as soon as she felt him next to her, immediately became very worried. She felt awkward because this had never happened before. When it was time to make her strike, she removed her hand and the arrow flew, but did not even hit any of the target's steps. Glenn said that it would take some practice for her to get used to it, but if she wanted, he could set aside some time to practice. Nadia cleared her throat, thanked him, and said that it would be just wonderful. She was about to leave, but then the man suddenly changed the subject and wanted to talk about what happened last time. As soon as she heard this, she immediately grabbed the bow harder and said that she was really fine and he shouldn't worry about it at all. She was surprised by the fact that he was still thinking about that situation. The man didn't answer anything to this. And turning away from her, he only thanked her for today. His ears even turned red as soon as he said these words. Well, Nadia, smiling happily, said that he shouldn't have thanked her. She was always happy. Meanwhile, when night fell, one of the maids named Auntie came to the deep forest in the dark. She approached one of the trees and, moving the bushes to the sides, finally saw that very basket with threads, scissors, and fabric. The maid was very glad that no one found her hiding place, and sitting under a tree, she began to embroider. However, it was incredibly dark outside, and she very often pricked herself with a needle because she could hardly see anything. But she did not despair and continued to do her work. But at that moment, a man suddenly approached her and shouted loudly, addressing her and asking who she was and what she was doing there. But when he came closer, the man saw that it was ID and asked what she was doing in such a place all alone, and late at night too. The maid, seeing him, immediately became very frightened. She decided not to answer his question and only asked what he was doing there late at night. The girl also hid her embroidery behind her back. The man explained that the lady asked him to heat the room, so he went to look for firewood. But then he suddenly noticed what was lying next to her and asked if she was secretly working part-time. He also started yelling at her, asking if close servants were allowed to do extra work. He was very angry and said that they were paid twice as much to take care of just one person, so he was outraged by the fact that she was doing this. He grabbed ID by the hand and started to lead her away, saying that everyone should have known what she was doing. He also said that her mistress was probably already asleep, but Lady Grace was still in the main house so she could talk to her. The maid immediately started screaming and asked that Jahab not do this, since she could have shared the money with him when she received it. But the man was very indignant and shouted at her even louder and asked if she really wanted him to have problems because of this too. He started to stop and, taking her away, told her not to talk nonsense, but to just walk silently. He brought the poor maid to the estate to Aunt Grace, and as soon as she saw her, she immediately asked the man what kind of noise they were making so late at night. The man explained that the maid served her mistress, but secretly also did sewing as an additional source of income. And instead of taking care of her mistress, at night she did other things in order to earn extra money. He shouted, pointed towards the maid who was lying on her knees, and said very loudly that she should throw her out of the mansion because such people had no place next to the honorable lady. Iris then looked at Grace and said that she did not betray her mistress, but simply wanted to earn extra money in order to help her family. But the woman, hearing this, was very surprised. She really wanted to listen to her justification because she became interested. The maid said with tears in her eyes that she needed money. Her salary was not enough for expensive medicine for a loved one who was terminally ill. Grace immediately told her to shut up, after which she answered what kind of medicine she needed that was so expensive. The maid replied that she received about 1 gold coin a month for all these medicines, so it was quite natural that her salary was not enough, and she had to make do as best she could. The woman then smiled, sat down opposite her, and asked if the marquise could not even take care of her own maids. The girl, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked what she meant. But the heroine then handed her a small bag of money and said that this should be enough to pay for her medication. When the next day came, Nadia was supposed to meet Mrs. Grace at her estate, but this visit was very unexpected for her. The woman greeted the Marquise and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, so she decided to visit them and ask how they were doing. She also said with a smile on her face that lunch had just ended and she was already at work. This surprised her very much. Nadia pointed to her desk and replied that it was her personal business. She was writing a reply letter to her father since they had agreed to correspond from time to time. As soon as Grace heard this, she was very surprised and also said that she was very sorry if she had disturbed her. But the Viscountess replied that this was not so. It was not such an urgent matter, so she invited the woman to sit down and talk. In fact, Nadia was confused. She didn't understand what could have happened because Grace was not one of those who could come to her at all. She didn't like her very much. Her husband's aunt sat down opposite the girl and said that she had actually come to her to ask the girl for forgiveness. Nadia, hearing that she wanted to apologize, was very surprised and could not believe that this could even be true. The woman really didn't understand why it all happened so suddenly, but Grace replied that she actually thought the girl was a spy who was pursuing her own goal in this matter. But she said that Nadia, after all, was so rejected, took care of Winterfell, and heard the conversation of the knights. She realized that she was really wrong with her conclusions. Grace, wiping away fake tears, said that she was very sorry that she did not acknowledge her sincerity and was very rude to her. She also asked if the girl could do her a great honor and accept her apology. Nadia did not wait long. Her wife, smiling happily, said that of course she was ready to accept them. She also smiled happily and said that she was incredibly happy that the woman herself decided to talk about it because she was the same aunt to her as she was to Glenn. Therefore, in the future, she could feel comfortable and not worry about anything. Grace was very surprised, but she tried to smile and said that she was grateful to her for this favor and also asked if the girl had already seen Glenn's father. She also said that she thought he didn't have long to live, so she suggested that Nadia go and say hello before he passed away. Nadia then thought about the fact that as soon as they got married, there were always guards in his rooms who did not allow anyone to enter there. But there was a certain difference because at that time everyone considered her a spy and was afraid that she could harm him. Now his opinion about the girl has changed a little. Nadia, smiling, said that this is exactly what she was going to do, Grace, getting up from her seat, and said that in that case she would already go under how much she was very worried that she could take up a lot of the girl's personal time, and she did not want that. Nadia asked her not to say that because she was incredibly happy about her visit, after which she turned to a maid named ID and asked her to accompany the mistress to the exit. The girls immediately went there, and as soon as they left the door, Nadia, sighing heavily, immediately frowned because she understood perfectly well that there was nothing good in this visit. She stood by the window for a while longer with her tea and thought about the words that Auntie had said to her. Nadia still couldn't get the thought out of her head that she had to visit the Marquise because she believed that there was probably a reason for such a sudden attitude. At that moment, the maid approached the girl and asked if she would like to drink some more tea. Nadia thanked her and said that it was completely unnecessary because she hadn't finished drinking it yet and didn't want any more. However, at that moment, the maid suddenly turned to her and asked for forgiveness. She asked if she really was going to go and visit the Marquise. The girl replied that of course not right away. However, she knew that she still needed to visit him. She had been planning to do so for a long time, but still had not had the opportunity to do so. She decided that she needed to take the chance and find out who was trying to harm him, and so she thought that this was the perfect idea for her. But at that moment, the maid came closer to her and said that she was perfectly aware of the fact that it did not concern her. However, she advised Nadia to be more careful. The girl immediately asked what she meant, and the maid explained that she had in no way slandered Grace because she knew how much she had tried for the sake of the family, and she was only worried about Nadia. The Viscountess smiled and said that she would definitely be careful, and also thanked Risa for her concern and said that it was really very valuable to her. At that moment, they suddenly heard some strange sounds coming from the window, and coming closer, they immediately listened. Then the girls saw that Grace suddenly lingered with the maid and was talking to her about something. Of course, this made Nadia very wary because she didn't understand why she decided to stop there. Risa then said that Ari was a maid close to the lady, but Lady Grace was no longer in charge of the house. so she also did not understand why the two of them had to be together. Nadia agreed and, while sipping tea, said that it really was somehow rather strange. The maid, suspicious, said that they had been standing there for a long time, so she did not understand what was happening there, but she could not find out. When some time had passed since that moment, Nadia turned to the butler, and he finally took her to Glenn's father. And as soon as Nadia saw this elderly man, she was very surprised because his face was incredibly haggard, and he looked really sick. The girl felt incredibly sorry for him, and she wanted to help him with all her might because she did not want such a wonderful man and ruler to suffer. The butler came closer to the man, turned to the gentleman and said that his son had married, his younger master had married, he even took the guy by the hand. He asked the man to open his eyes and see for himself how wonderful their new Marquis Glenn was. He had made the right choice. Smiling, the butler also said that the man had always told him that he wanted to support his grandchildren, and the new Marquise was beautiful and smart, so she was an ideal match for his son. Gordon said that the union of these two wonderful people would give them many beautiful children and worthy heirs. He took his hand again and asked the man to at least just open his eyes and look at her. But there was no reaction. Then the butler looked at the lady and asked her to bow before the remarkable Marquise. Nadia bowed at that moment and thought that glam most likely came to him every time. And every time she wondered how much it hurt him to see his dear father in such a state. But bowing and curtsying, the girl greeted Sir Isaac of Winterfell, saying her name. She explained that she was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Balasite, and smiling tenderly, she came even closer to him and said that she had recently gotten married and became a member of their family. Even though she had little experience, she was going to do everything possible to avoid tarnishing her reputation. In fact, she was incredibly sorry because she had tricked Glenn into marrying her. But nevertheless, her words were sincere, and she really wanted everything to be fine. And she really was only going to leave after she had made Winterfell much better and more successful because they deserved it and it was in her hands. When they tried there for some time, the two of them went out the door, and the butler very carefully began to lock the room with a chain and even a padlock. Nadia noticed that the security of this room was monitored quite well there, and even all the windows were locked. Of course, she noticed how attentive everyone around her was. No one could just walk in and out of the Marquis's room. As expected, someone close to the Marquis was behind the murder, so she became wary, trying to think about who it could ultimately be. However, at that moment, Glenn approached them, and as soon as Gordon saw him, he immediately said hello. The man, seeing his wife, was genuinely surprised and asked what she was doing in that corridor, since he had never seen her there before, and she was standing next to his father's room. Nadia came closer to him and said that she was a little late, but wanted to visit the Marquis because she was an official member of the Winterfell house, and that was how it was supposed to be. The man replied that he understood everything, but Nadia, suddenly looking down, asked if they could now go to the Marquis together. She thought that when she saw him in such a state, it was immediately clear that he was very lonely, so she decided to offer such an alternative. But the man, upon hearing this proposal, was at first incredibly surprised. But after thinking it over and weighing all the pros and cons, he agreed. Then Nadia went towards her office and smiling said that in that case, they should have seen each other again, and also wished him to have a good visit with his father. And when she suddenly left, she remembered another question that she wanted to discuss with the man, so she stopped and turned to him again. Nadia said that she would like him to spend some time with her after he visited his father because she would like to talk to him. Glenn was a little surprised, but still didn't mind. After that, they each went their separate ways. When night came, Nadia was lying in her bed and reading some papers. The maids who stood next to her looked very worried. Risa plucked up her courage and turned to the lady and said that it was time for her to go to bed, since it was already midnight. As soon as Nadia heard this, she was very surprised and asked if time had really flown by so quickly, since she hadn't even noticed it. One of the maids said that she had heard that in other families no one stayed so long, but the girl worked harder than everyone else, and this worried them. Another said that it was indeed so, but the Marquis was the same and did not understand when he would admit that he had the most hard-working and kind wife. They would really like for them to start getting along again. And after that, she asked if it wouldn't be better for them to use the love potion in order to speed up this process. But the maid quickly threw these thoughts aside and, coming closer to her mistress, asked if she knew the legend of the 1,000-year-old tree. Nadia, upon hearing about this, immediately put the papers aside and said that she had never heard of such a thing before, so of course she didn't know. Then the maid told her that the legend said that near the northern gate of the castle there grew one large tree. It was 1,000-year-old tree, and it existed even before the castle itself was built. It was magical and filled with spirits. It's set aside only one day in the spring, and only at night did the legend exist that if you pray to this tree for love, you could make anyone fall in love with you. The other maids began to support her and told the mistress that it was indeed true that this tree had managed to unite more than one couple in this way. And another one asked if maybe she should make a wish as a joke, and then they would check whether it came true or not, just for the sake of an experiment. But Nadia sighed heavily and said that it was just a legend, so she didn't see any point in it. Getting up from her bed and seeing their pitiful faces, she wondered if they just wanted to look at this tree. The maids replied that they had only heard that it was very beautiful and bloomed only once, and if they had gone out at night, the head maid would certainly have scolded them for it. And another maid suggested that Nadia go with them so that everything would go well and they would all see this beautiful tree. The girl did not object and suggested going there anyway, and also asked when it was supposed to bloom. Risa replied that it was supposed to happen a few days after the full moon, and the other maids began to thank her and said that they loved her incredibly much. When the next morning came, some of the maids were still asleep in their separate staff room. Risa woke up first because she heard someone making noise and immediately decided to check what was happening. Her sleep was quite light. She turned to the figure she saw in front of her and asked what had happened and why she had woken up so early. The girl, who was already in the maid uniform, replied that nothing had happened. She just wanted to get up early. Risa was very surprised because it was quite strange, and she wondered how many hours this girl usually slept. She turned to her and asked if she had to go somewhere that day, and also asked if she needed to prepare for it. Auntie replied that she simply thought that she should go to the cafeteria in order to be there first and take the dishes that she liked. However, at that moment, she took out from the drawer the very bag that Grace had given her and accidentally dropped it. And from there, precious gold coins began to pour out into her. Risa, seeing all this, was very surprised. It was as if the dream had disappeared, and she asked if these were really gold coins. Meanwhile, the maid very quickly began to collect the coins, and her partner asked where she could have gotten so many gold coins. Well, of course, the maid wasn't going to explain anything to her. She quickly gathered all her things and ran out of the room, saying that it was time for her to go. Risa was surprised by her behavior. She did not understand what had happened, so she began to suspect the girl of some strange things even more. When some time had passed since that moment, the girl had already woken up normally and went to the dining room, where several maids were already sitting. She was upset. When Risa saw that there was no ID there, she was very surprised. After all, they had agreed to go to the canteen, but she never came. She approached the maid and asked if it was true that she was responsible for the food that day, and then she asked if she had accidentally eaten anything else. As soon as the maid named Misha heard this, you said that she had not even seen her that day and therefore could not answer her anything. Then Risa approached another maid and asked her if she had seen ID in the dining room that day. She explained that it was a maid who was close to the mistress. Heisel replied that she hadn't seen her for several days and that she had seemed rather withdrawn and distant lately. Risa immediately became wary. She didn't understand where the girl could have disappeared to in such a case. And besides, this secretive behavior and the money that suddenly appeared did not give her any reason to be calm. She thought that something had definitely been going on lately, so the girl decided that she absolutely had to find out about this issue. When several days had passed, the lady and her maids actually went late at night to that mysterious place where the tree was growing in order to look at it. One of the maids looked at the sky and happily said that there wasn't even a single cloud, and they were very lucky because on such a day, the flowers were definitely supposed to bloom. Risa agreed with her and said that she had heard that these flowers of the 1,000-year-old tree were incredibly beautiful, and if you saw them once, you would never be able to forget them. Risa told the lady that inside the tree was the spirit of the daughter of the goddess of love, so it was she who decided all love affairs. The girl also told the lady that they decided to pray for her so that everything would be fine for her, and the other agreed with her and even suggested that if they all prayed together, it would come true faster. Nadia laughed and said that she, of course, was incredibly grateful to them. However, she decided that in this way, they would be too much of a burden on the spirit, and she did not want that. Some time passed from that moment, and the first time she saw the 1,000-year-old tree, she screamed loudly and began to point the lady in its direction. And as soon as Nadia looked at him, she was simply delighted. She couldn't look away for a second. This tree really turned out to be amazing. All the flowers that grew on it blossomed into beautiful pink and white flowers. They shimmered in the moonlight and created an even greater effect. She came closer to him and said that this was an incredible sight, something like no one had ever seen in their life. Adara took it out, smiling, and said that it was really wonderful. And Risa said that if the girl had made a wish, then the Marquis would have definitely changed his mind and would have definitely started to show attention to her. Nadia, coming closer, thought that it was really wonderful, and it would be great if Glenn saw it with his own eyes. But then suddenly the girl became embarrassed because she did not understand at all why she suddenly thought about him. After all, this had never happened before. Rice then approached the tree and told the lady that she needed to close her eyes, after which she began to address the spirit and asked him to make the Marquis fall in love with their lady. She really wanted these two to live happily ever after in Winterfell and not know any troubles, and soon even give birth to heirs. Nadia looked at her and didn't even smile. She was of course grateful to the girl. However, she and Glenn were not destined to be together. Someday she would have to leave this state. However, she actually decided to pray too and wish for Glam to find his true love, which he deserved. The girl really thought that this was a good alternative, so she closed her eyes and prayed. Her hair was blowing in the wind, and she looked as beautiful as this 1,000-year-old tree. She thought that someday on that land Glenn would find happiness with a girl who would become the mistress of Winterfell and take care of him with all her heart. She would really like for him to one day definitely find the one he truly loves, and for her to love him in return. When Nadia finished her prayer, she even smiled. She thought that perhaps Glenn could make her happy, even though he seemed cold at first glance. But in fact, he is a very kind and sensitive person. But then suddenly she felt a little sad, and she didn't understand why in that case she had such strange feelings, because she really wished him all the best. Then Rice, who stepped aside, said that the wish of the lady was bound to come true, the Swinterfell brand, and she was famous for her wonderful relationship, even though their marriage was one of convenience. They actually assumed that the tree had given its blessing. However, Rice asked if they could stay there for a little while longer. The girl was a little embarrassed, but she said that she would very much like to admire this beautiful sight for some time, because she did not know when the next time would be the opportunity to look at it. But the girl did not object. She smiled and immediately said that they could watch as much as they wanted, and she herself thought about the fact that it was not so bad to secretly run away at night without notifying anyone about it. It was even fun. However, suddenly when the wind blew again, she felt that she had become a little cooler, and she didn't like it very much. Suddenly the maid came up to her and told the lady that she was shaking all over, and also asked if it was true that it was cold at night. Nadia, smiling, agreed with her and said that it really was a little uncomfortable. Then Auntie turned to the other maids and said that she needed to return the mistress back, and for now they could stay there and admire, and she would return to them later. Nadia, so she said that if they were somehow seen, they should have said that they were together, and she was the first to simply leave. The girls beamed with joy and thanked the lady, telling her to have a good rest at that moment, and ID took her friend and led her somewhere deep into the forest. When they left, Risa suddenly paid attention to the direction they were going. She was very surprised because, in order to get to the estate faster, it was better to go from the north than from the south. She even suggested that there might be a road that she didn't know, but she still felt some anxiety about where her maid had led her. Meanwhile, the girl and the maid were walking, and Nadia said that it was cold in the north even at this time of year, although in the capital it was warm even at night. Auntie said she didn't even notice it, and said it was probably because she was used to the northern weather, so she felt comfortable everywhere. And Nadia suddenly wondered if she could ever get used to this, because she really did feel constant discomfort when it was cold. The maid, smiling happily, said that of course she was in this place for a long time, so she should definitely soon get used to it and get comfortable. They walked further and further, and then suddenly the girls heard a rough voice of a man who told them to stop immediately.